Part 1 of Contemporary Reviews of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mrs. Woolf's new novel, an unsigned review from the Times Literary Supplement, Thursday, May the 5th, 1927. Each of Mrs. Woolf's novels has inspired a lively curiosity as to the next. One wondered what would follow Mrs. Dalloway, and its successor, with certain points of likeness, is yet a different thing. It is still more different from most other stories. A case like Mrs. Woolf's makes one feel the difficulty of getting a common measure to estimate fiction, for her work, so adventurous and intellectually imaginative, really invites a higher test than is applied to most novels. In form, To the Lighthouse is as elastic as a novel can be. It has no plot, though it has a scheme and a motive. It shows characters in outline rather than in the round, and, while it depends almost entirely on the passing of time, it expands or contracts the time sense very freely. The first and longest part of the book is almost stationary, and describes a party of people gathered in the summer at a house on the Scottish coast. James, the youngest of the Ramsay children, is thwarted of a visit to the lighthouse. In the next part, much briefer, sea winds and caretakers are having their way with the house, while 1 year follows another. Mrs. Ramsay and her eldest daughter have died, a son is killed in the war, and the place is forsaken. In the last part, the house is alive again with the surviving Ramsays and 2 of the former guests. Mr. Ramsay, the philosopher, grimly magnificent, heads an expedition to the lighthouse, and James, now 16, accomplishes his dream, though all the family have a sense of paternal tyranny. Such are the bare bones of the framework, but one feels they are no more like the whole story than the skeleton carved in a medieval tomb is to the robed and comely effigy above it. For the book has its own motion, a soft stir and light of perceptions, meeting or crossing, of the gestures and attitudes, the feelings and thoughts of people, of instants in which these are radiant or absurd, have the burden of sadness or of the inexplicable. It is a reflective book, with an ironical or wistful questioning of life and reality. Somehow this steals into the pages, whether there is a sunny peace in the garden, or Mrs. Ramsay is interrupted in a fairy tale, or a couple is late for dinner, so that one is inclined to say that this question of the meaning of things, however masked, is not only the essence, but the real protagonist in the story. One is hardly surprised when it emerges openly now and again towards the end. What was it then? What did it mean? Could things thrust their hands up and grip one? Could the blade cut, the fist grasp? Was there no safety, no learning by heart of the ways of the world? No guide, no shelter, but all was miracle and leaping from the pinnacle of a tower into the air. Could it be, even for elderly people, that this was life? Startling, unexpected, unknown. For one moment she felt that if they both got up, here now on the lawn, and demanded an explanation, why was it so short, why was it so inexplicable, said it with violence, as 2 fully equipped human beings from whom nothing should be hid might speak. Then beauty would roll itself up. The space would fill. Those empty flourishes would form into shape. If they shouted loud enough, Mrs. Ramsay would return. "Mrs. Ramsay," she said aloud. "Mrs. Ramsay." The tears ran down her face. Perhaps this is one reason why you are less conscious of Mrs. Woolf's characters than they are of each other. They have an acute consciousness which reminds you of the people in Henry James, but with a difference. The characters of Henry James are so absorbed in each other that they have no problem beyond the truth or otherwise of their relations, and they are so intensely seen as persons that they are real. But the people in Mrs. Wolfe's book seem to be looking through each other at some farther question, and although they interact vividly, they are not completely real. No doubt, as Lily Briscoe the painter thinks in the novel, to know people in outline is one way of knowing them, and they are seen here in the way they are meant to be seen. But the result is that, while you know quite well the kind of people represented in the story, they lack something as individuals. Mr. Ramsay, certainly, masterful and helpless, egotist and hero, does leave a deep mark by the end. His wife, with her calm beauty, her sympathy, and swift, decided actions, is more of a type, though her personality is subtly pervasive even when she has ceased to live. But there is a significant curtness in the parenthesis which, surely with a slip in punctuation, announces her death. Mr. Ramsay, stumbling along a passage, stretched his arms out one dark morning, but Mrs. Ramsay having died rather suddenly the night before he stretched his arms out, they remained empty. Here, Mrs. Wolfe's detachment seems a little strained, and, in fact, this transitional part of the book is not its strongest part. One comes back, however, to the charm and pleasure of her design. It is carried through with a rare subtlety. Every little thread in it, Mr. Ramsay writing a book, Lily Briscoe struggling with her picture, the lights in the bay, the pathos and the absurdity, is woven in one texture, which has piquancy and poetry by turns. A sad book in the main, with all its entertainment, it is one to return to, for it has that power of leaving a vision which is less often found perhaps in novels than in a short story. This springs from a real emotion, best described in the words of Mrs. Wolfe's own. There might be lovers whose gift it was to choose out the elements of things and place them together, and so, giving them a wholeness not theirs in life, make of some scene or meeting of people, all now gone and separate, one of those globed, compacted things over which thought lingers and love plays. End of Part 1. Part 2 of Contemporary Reviews of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Virginia Woolf Explores an English Country Home by Louis Kronenberger. The New York Times Book Review, May the 8th, 1927. To the Lighthouse is a brilliantly ambitious analysis of domestic psychology. It was with Mrs. Dalloway that Virginia Woolf achieved a novel of first-rate importance rather than of great promise and talent. And as a method in fiction, Mrs. Dalloway has begun already to make its influence keenly felt. Two novels of the present season seem to pay it the tribute of imitation. It is written all over Natalie S. Colby's highly successful Green Forest, and just a faint flavour of it creeps into Babette Deutsch's much less successful In Such a Night. The method of Mrs. Dalloway is substantially retained by Mrs. Wolfe in this new novel, To the Lighthouse, but though one encounters again her strikingly individual mingling of inward thought with outward action, in which the stream of consciousness style is liberated from its usual chaos and by means of selection and a sense of order made formally compact, one finds the method applied to somewhat different aims. Mrs. Dalloway, of course, is Clarissa Dalloway from cover to cover, and for that reason it has a magnificently concentrated clarity. It is Clarissa in relation to herself, her family, her friends, her servants, her milieu. It is her servants, her family, her friends in relation to her. To the Lighthouse, on the other hand, is a book of interrelationships among people, and though there are major and minor characters, the major ones are not, as Clarissa Dalloway was, the alpha and omega of the story, but more truly the means for giving to the story its harmony and unity, its focal points. Those who reject To the Lighthouse as inferior to Mrs. Dalloway because it offers no one with half the memorable lucidity of Clarissa Dalloway must fail to perceive its larger and artistically more difficult aims. They must fail to notice the richer qualities of mind and imagination and emotion which Mrs. Wolfe, perhaps not wanting them, omitted from Mrs. Dalloway. They must fail to appreciate that as an author develops, he will always break down the perfection he has achieved in an earlier stage of his writing in order to reach new objectives. To the Lighthouse is a book in 3 parts, in 3 movements. All of it is laid at the summer home of an English family named Ramsay in the Hebrides. The first portion occupying an afternoon and evening, the second portion constituting an interlude of 10 years during which the house remains unoccupied, the third portion occupying a morning at the end of these 10 years. The Ramsays are a middle-aged couple when the book opens, with 8 children, who have with them at their summer place about 6 friends. Husband and wife, though very different, are in love with each other. Mrs. Ramsay, who though 50 is beautiful, has charm, intelligence, understanding. Also, she is a little anxious to have a hand in things, a little anxious to be liked, a little anxious to keep her illusions and have others keep theirs. Her children love her. They do not love their father. She works harder to hold their love. The best minds about her seemingly mistrust her a little, dislike her a little, for her charm is persuasive rather than compelling. She watches those about her without mingling too much, both because she chooses a vantage point, symbolized by the window, and because of her personality she becomes the dominant and focal figure of the group. Ramsay is less easy to understand, possibly because he is given less attention. In many ways he is a more interesting as well as original character, brilliant no doubt, but introverted, lacking those immediate graces which win for his wife the greater love of their children, lacking the warmth, too, and a sense of social compromise. Rigid in his truthfulness, a man, a thinker, where his wife is a woman, a psychologist. He lacks sensitiveness, one feels. Either that, or his sensitiveness is a very deep and hidden one. He loves his wife, they have a fundamental understanding, yet he is not a help to her in their relationships with others. And around them are their children and their friends, the fumbling Lily Briscoe, the one-sided and arrogant, yet somehow pathetic Tansley, a true product of early environment, the serene Mr. Carmichael, somehow above the clash of personalities, the unimportant couple who become engaged. They are an assortment of lives, most of them moving in different directions, yet moving, at least intermittently, under the influence of Mrs. Ramsay, who, beneath the stress of their presence, cannot quite find the chance to have her own inner life. Then 10 years pass. Mrs. Ramsay and 2 of her children die, the house remains uninhabited, and finally some of those who were together 10 years before come to the summer house again. It is a different house without Mrs. Ramsay, and to Lily Briscoe at least it must always compare itself with the house of 10 years before, and Mrs. Ramsay's existence in it must go on in the spirit. And Mr. Ramsay and 2 of his children do what 10 years before remained undone because of bad weather. They row across the bay to the lighthouse. Reaching it, they achieve a climax, the end of a period. It is the final portion of the book which is most perplexing. It seems to sound in the minor what the long first portion rounded in the major, to persist as an ironical mood, to re-establish a scene with the sorry changes time has wrought, to reduce a symbolical achievement when it is finally made to the level of negation. The long opening portion seems to be carrying you ahead towards something which will be magnificently expressive, and then this final portion becomes obscure, a matter of arcs, of fractions, of uncoordinated notes. By comparison with the rest, this final portion seems pale and weak. Perhaps there is a reason for this. Perhaps Mrs. Wolfe meant to show that with Mrs. Ramsay's death things fall apart, gets beyond correlation. Mr. Ramsay is no longer interesting. Can it be because he is no longer counterpoised against his wife? Life seems drifting as the Ramsays drift over the bay in their boat, and all their physical vigour and all their reaching of the lighthouse at last conveys no significance. The truth is that this final portion of the book strikes a minor note, not an intentional minor note, which might still in the artistic sense be major, but a meaningless minor note, which conveys the feeling that one has not quite arrived somewhere, that the story which opens brilliantly and carries on through a magnificent interlude ends with too little force and expressiveness. At any rate, the rest of the book has its excellences. Like Mrs. Dalloway, it is underlaid with Mrs. Wolfe's ironic feeling toward life, though here character is not pitted against manners, but against other character. Once again Mrs. Wolfe makes use of her remarkable method of characterization, a method not based on observation or personal experience, but purely synthetic, purely creational. Clarissa Dalloway is a marvellous synthesis, and it is just for that reason that Mrs. Dalloway, which has been identified because of its modernity with the Ulysses school, differs from it in character fundamentals, for it is as objective as Ulysses is autobiographical and observational. There is nothing photographic about Mrs. Wolfe's characters here, or in Mrs. Dalloway. Neither Clarissa nor Mrs. Ramsay has anything autobiographical about her. Both are complete creations, and both, for all their charm and graces, must suffer a little beneath the searchlight of Mrs. Wolfe's independently used mind and sense of irony. Into the lighthouse there is nobody who even approaches Clarissa Dalloway in completeness and memorability, but on a smaller and perhaps more persuasive scale, Mrs. Ramsay achieves powerful reality. The other characters are not fully alive because they are not whole enough. Most of them are one-dimensional fragments that have been created with great insight but insufficient vitality. They have minds, moods, emotions, but they get all three through creative intellect. For passion, Mrs. Wolfe has no gift. Her people never invade the field of elementary emotions. They are hardly animal at all. It is, I think, in the superb interlude called Time Passes that Mrs. Wolfe reaches the most impressive height of the book. And there one can find a new note in her work, something beyond the ironic sophistication and civilized human values of Mrs. Dalloway. In this description of the unused house in the Hebrides, entered for 10 years only by old and forlorn women caretakers, and the wind and the sea air and the light of the lighthouse lamp, she has told the story of all life passing on, of change and destruction and solitude and waste, the story which more than a little embodies the plot action of the rest of the book, but above all the story which has for man the profoundest human values of all, though for 10 years the house itself never received a human guest. The great beauty of these 18 pages of prose carries in it an emotional and ironical undertone that is superior to anything else that the first-class technician, the expert stylist, the deft student of human life in Mrs. Wolfe ever has done. Here is prose of extraordinary distinction in our time. Here is poetry. But what, after all, is one night? A short space, especially when the darkness dims so soon, and so soon a bird sings, a cock crows, or a faint green quickens like a turning leaf in the hollow of the wave. Night, however, succeeds to night. The winter holds a pack of them in store, and deals them equally, evenly, with indefatigable fingers. They lengthen, they darken. Some of them hold aloft clear planets, plates of brightness. So the lighthouse has not the formal perfection, the cohesiveness, the intense vividness of characterization that belong to Mrs. Dalloway. It has particles of failure in it. It is inferior to Mrs. Dalloway in the degree to which its aims are achieved. It is superior in the magnitude of the aims themselves, for in its portrayal of life that is less orderly, more complex, and so much doomed to frustration, it strikes a more important note, and it gives us an interlude of vision that must stand at the head of all Virginia Woolf's work. End of Part 2. Part 3 of Contemporary Reviews of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From Virginia Woolf and Others by Rachel A. Taylor. From The Spectator, May 14th, 1927. The dark light, the bright shadow, was what Leonardo sought, he said, through all the sciences and all the arts. The bright shadow, the dark light, seemed to shift and flicker and fuse in strange pavan to make the fascinating chiaroscuro of the novels of Mrs. Woolf. The woven paces of dark and bright on the lovely superficies of any book of hers offer an aesthetic pleasure so deep that at moments you almost forget the dreaming figures beneath, whose vibrating hearts actually create that enigmatic pattern. Enigmatic, darkly bright, flowing into the secret recesses of the consciousness, floating out its rose-pale shells, its wavering shapes, its blood-red coral, moulding people that combine a modern irony with a mystic reverie. The genius of Virginia Woolf is at once more difficult and more original than that of any other woman novelist of today. Mrs. Dalloway is a thing perfect in its kind, a gleaming, super-subtle piece of fine filaments of impression and emotion gathered into the pattern of the rose, a complete crystal eddy of the river of life. To the Lighthouse is not so flawless in its aesthetic effect. The unities agree with this novelist's power, and here the unity of time is rather violently broken, while the parts of the book seem disproportionate. But it is even more wistfully human, perhaps. Nothing happens, and everything happens. To the lighthouse the child James desires to go, and, sitting by his mother's feet, is tauntingly denied by his despotic, myriad-mooded father. To the lighthouse, long years after, he does go, dragged there, reluctant by that despotic, myriad-minded father, and is suddenly, mysteriously reconciled with him in his heart. Between these incidents, people are born and marry and die, but all these matters are incidental to the souls that cross and intercross in the web of an everlasting reverie. In this book there are secret flames in flowers and inanimate things, waking in response to the fixed gaze of the unconscious symbolists, who are weaving them into the tapestry of their dreams. Subtle sensations are caught here that are elusive as a fragrance or a flavour. Psychical processes are laid bare by burning, piercing images. Cadences are heard that never violate the rhythm of prose, yet chime aerial and strange as the rhythm of verse. In the ghostly second part, where the perishing life of the house sighs away, the lamenting style, with its lilted-in refrains and its bitter tragic parentheses, in some passages chants heavily and dreamily like the prose litanies of Mallarmé, Frisson d'hiver, for example. Indeed, more beauty and penetrative characterization than can here be described resides within this book. The Ramsays, husband and wife, move at the centre of attention, along with red torch plants in the twilight garden. The husband is a remarkably observed figure, but I prefer to linger a moment on his wife, who has the deathless grace, regality, and sweetness of legendary women. She is whimsical, extravagant in speech, absurd a little, versed in all tender ways of loving. She bewitches you. Even the crude Tansley thinks of cyclamen and violets when he sees her, as if, stepping through fields of flowers, taking to her breast buds that had broken and lambs that had fallen. Yet she is lost in an endless sad reverie. She feels remote and lonely like the white beam of the lighthouse laid on the darkness. She is sorrowful for something lost, out of time, something that, found, would illuminate eternity. So her spirit goes veiled and dreamy, like the carved Greek women mourning on the side of a Sidonian sarcophagus. Under the modern talk, all the folk around her go sunken also in their peculiar meditation. But why, when this account of the interaction of naked thinking hearts needs merely a setting of a house and a terrace, some rocks and a bay and a lighthouse, must the house be placed in the Hebrides? Mrs. Wolfe creates her own atmosphere wherever she takes her people, but to anybody who has been subdued by the magic of the Hebridean atmosphere, there is a disturbance of impression, a collision of spiritual values. Her pattern should never be superimposed. End of Part 3. Part 4 of Contemporary Reviews of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Novel as Work of Art. Review by Conrad Aiken in The Dial, Chicago, July 1927. Among contemporary writers of fiction, Mrs. Wolfe is a curious and anomalous figure. In some respects she is as modern, as radical, as Mr. Joyce or Miss Richardson or Monsieur Jules Romain. She is a highly self-conscious examiner of consciousness, a bold and original experimenter with the technique of novel writing, but she is also, and just as strikingly, in other respects, old-fashioned. This anomaly does not defy analysis. The aroma of old-fashionedness that rises from these highly original and modern novels, from the pages of Jacob's Room, Mrs. Dalloway, and now again from those of To the Lighthouse, is a quality of attitude, a quality, to use a word which is itself nowadays old-fashioned, but none the less fragrant, of spirit. For in this regard, Mrs. Wolfe is no more modern than Jane Austen. She breathes the same air of gentility, of sequestration, of tradition, of life and people and things, all brought by the slow polish of centuries of tradition and use, to a pervasive refinement in which discrimination on every conceivable plane has become as instinctive and easy as the beat of a wing. Her people are gentle people. Her houses are the houses of gentlefolk, and the consciousness that informs both is a consciousness of well-being and culture, of the richness and lustre and dignity of tradition, a disciplined consciousness in which emotions and feelings find their appropriate attitudes as easily and naturally, as habitually, one is tempted to say, as a skilled writer finds words. It is this tightly circumscribed choice of scene, to use scene in a social sense, that gives to Mrs. Wolfe's novels, despite her modernity of technique and insight, their odd and delicious air of parochialism, as of some small village world, as bright and vivid and perfect in its tininess as a miniature, a small complete world which time has somehow missed. Going into these houses, one would almost expect to find antimacassars on the chair-backs and daguerreotype albums on the tables, for these people, these Clarissa Dalloways and Mrs. Ramsays and Lily Briscoes, are all vibrantly and saturatedly conscious of background, and they all have the curious innocence that accompanies that sort of awareness. They are the creatures of seclusion, the creatures of shelter. They are exquisite beings, so perfectly and elaborately adapted to their environment that they have taken on something of the roundness and perfection of works of art. Their life, in a sense, is a sea-pool life, unruffled and secret, almost, if we can share the cool illusion of the sea-pool's occupants, inviolable. They hear rumours of the sea itself, that vast and terrifying force that lies somewhere beyond them or around them, but they cherish a sublime faith that it will not disturb them, and if it does at last break in upon them with cataclysmic force, a chaos of disorder and undisciplined violence. They can find no language for the disaster. They are simply bewildered. But if, choosing such people and such a mise-en-scène for her material, Mrs. Wolfe inevitably makes her readers think of Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park, she compels us just as sharply by her method of evoking them to think of Pilgrimage and Ulysses and The Death of a Nobody. Mrs. Wolfe is an excellent critic, an extremely conscious and brilliant craftsman in prose. She is intensely interested in the technique of fiction, and one has at times wondered, so vividly from her prose has arisen a kind of self-consciousness of adroitness, whether she might not lose her way and give us a mere series of virtuosities or tour de force. It is easy to understand why Catherine Mansfield distrusted Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. She felt a kind of sterility in this dexterous holding of the raw stuff of life at arm's length, this playing with it as if it were a toy. Why not be more immediate? Why not surrender to it? And one did indeed feel a rather baffling aloofness in this attitude. It was as if Mrs. Wolfe were a little afraid to come to grips with anything so coarse, preferred to see it through a safe thickness of plate glass. It was as if she could not be quite at ease with life until she had stilled it, reduced it to the mobile immobility of art, reduced it even to such comfortable proportions and orderliness as would not disturb the drawing-room. In Jacob's room, however, and Mrs. Dalloway, Mrs. Wolfe began to make it clear that this tendency to sterile dexterity, though pronounced, might not be fatal. And now, in her new novel, To the Lighthouse, she relieves one's doubts on this score almost entirely. For, if one still feels during the first part of this novel, almost depressingly and intermittently thereafter, Mrs. Wolfe's irritating air as of carrying an enormous technical burden, her air of saying, "See how easily I do this," or "This is incomparably complex and difficult, but I have the brains for it." Nevertheless, one's irritation is soon lost in the growing sense that Mrs. Wolfe has at last found a complexity and force of theme which is commensurate with the elaborateness and self-consciousness of her technical pattern. By degrees one forgets the manner in the matter. One resists the manner, petulantly objects to it in vain. The moment comes when at last one ceases to be aware of something persistently artificial in this highly feminine style, and finds oneself simply immersed in the vividness and actuality of this world of Mrs. Wolfe's, believing in it in fact with the utmost intensity, and feeling it with the completeness of surrender which one feels the most moving of poetry. It is not easy to say whether this abdication of distance on the reader's part indicates that Mrs. Wolfe has now achieved a depth of poetic understanding, a vitality which was somehow just lacking in the earlier novels, or whether it merely indicates a final triumph of technique. Can one profitably try to make a distinction between work that is manufactured, bitterly and strenuously, by sheer will to imagination, and work that is born of imagination all complete, assuming that the former is, in the upshot, just as convincing as the latter? Certainly one feels everywhere in Mrs. Wolfe's work this will to imagine, this canvassing of possibilities by a restless and searching and brilliant mind. One feels this mind at work, matching and selecting, rejecting this colour and accepting that, saying, "It is this that the heroine would say, it is this that she would think." And nevertheless Mrs. Wolfe's step is so sure, her choice is so nearly invariably right, and her imagination, even if deliberately willed, is so imaginative, that in the end she makes a beautiful success of it. She makes her Mrs. Ramsay, by giving us her stream of consciousness, amazingly alive, and she supplements this just sufficiently from outside, as it were, by giving us also, intermittently, the streams of consciousness of her husband, of her friend Lily Briscoe, of her children, so that we are documented as to Mrs. Ramsay from every quarter, and arrive at a solid vision of her by a process of triangulation. The richness and copiousness and ease with which this is done are a delight. These people are astoundingly real. They belong to a special class, as Mrs. Wolfe's characters nearly always do, and exhale a Jane Austenish aroma of smallness and lostness and incompleteness. But they are magnificently real. We live in that delicious house with them. We feel the minute textures of their lives with their own vivid senses. We imagine with their extraordinary imaginations, are self-conscious with their self-consciousness, and ultimately we know them as well, as terribly as we know ourselves. Thus, curiously, Mrs. Wolfe has rounded the circle. Apparently, at the outset of her work, avoiding any attempt to present life immediately, as Chekhov and Catherine Mansfield preferred to do, and choosing instead a medium more sophisticated and conscious, as if she never for a moment wished us to forget the frame of the picture, and the fact that the picture was a picture, she finally brought this method to such perfection, or so perfectly allowed it to flower of itself, that the artificial has become natural, the mediate has become immediate. The technical brilliance glows, melts, falls away, and there remains a poetic apprehension of life, of extraordinary loveliness. Nothing happens in this houseful of odd, nice people, and yet all of life happens. The tragic futility, the absurdity, the pathetic beauty of life. We experience all of this in our sharing of 7 hours of Mrs. Ramsay's wasted or not wasted existence. We have seen through her the world. End of Part 4. Part 5 of Contemporary Reviews of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sensitives by A.M. From the Manchester Guardian, 20th of May, 1927. One hopes not to fumble unforgivably in dealing with a book so fine in workmanship as Mrs. Wolfe's, so delicate in such intentions as we have divined. The background is sky, with the natives negligible, the canvas being peopled by the Ramsay family and their visitors, a sophisticated and cultivated set. But the subtle, lonely land and seascape counts, for it isolates them, giving them more significance, perhaps, than might be their due were they merely characters in a story. They have another use. The book is a study of sensitives by sensitivists. Minds are opened, especially Mrs. Ramsay's and the plain spinster Lily Briscoe's, for us to watch the hints, impressions, reflections, flashes from other minds and beings, now dancing up and down like a swarm of gnats, again for a moment fixed and coloured spectrum-wise before the final rapid blend of sympathetic comprehension. Thus Mr. Ramsay, the vain egotist, albeit pathetic and of a fiery unworldliness, we know chiefly through the brilliant intuitions of his beautiful, clear-souled, and indulgent wife, a non-intellectual, and her we are vividly aware of mainly through the partial intuitions of devoted friends, who helplessly see her, victim yet content. But Lily, unlucky in life as an artist, is the most gifted with this uncanny power. She has the compensation, if it be one, that her mind is all alive with human experiences, enlightenments, and humours, that she owns her world, if she cannot bend it to her will or fantasy. As we look at the party grouped friendly-wise in their summer quarters, though humour is playing about them lightly all the time, we receive an impression of the intense loneliness of each. There may be more than one symbolic meaning attached to the lighthouse of the title and of the opening and closing incidents. Is it the isolated watching mind? Is it the thing remote, so passionately desired, which turns to nothingness when we are forced to pursue it by the arrogant will of another. A deep and reticent homage to beauty speaks under the recorded irritations and frustrations of the passing day, while an austere resignation follows hard on natural yearnings after the permanent and the perfect. For our penitence deserves a glimpse only, and our toil respite only. End of Part 5. Part 6 of Contemporary Reviews of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From Review by Edwin Muir in The Nation and Athenaeum, July 2nd, 1927. To the Lighthouse is a novel difficult to judge. Like the last volume on this list, it stands at the summit of the development of a remarkable writer. Its aim is high and serious, its technique brilliant. There are more beautiful pages in it than Mrs. Woolf has written before. A unique intuition and intelligence are at work in it almost continuously and at high pressure. The difficulties which the author surmounts in it are such as few contemporary novelists would even attempt. Its positive merits are thus very high, yet as a whole, though showing an advance on many sides, it produces a less congruous and powerful effect than Mrs. Dalloway. The novel consists of 3 parts. In the first we have a picture of Mrs. Ramsay's summer household in the Hebrides before the war. In the second, an imaginative evocation of time passing away over the house, deserted now for several years. In the last, Mr. Ramsay's return as a widower, with 2 of his family and 2 old friends, the remnant of the large circle which has been reduced in the meantime by death and other causes. In the first book, James, a young boy, had been promised that he would be taken to the lighthouse, but it rains and he cannot go. In the last book, he is a youth now. He goes with his father and his sister, and everything is different. The symbolism is plain enough, but in the novel so entangled is it with other matters, interesting enough in themselves, that it becomes obscured. Actually, it is obscured most by the device which should make it most clear, the intermediary book called Time Passes, which, to add to the difficulty, is the best of the lot, and could only have been written by a writer of profound imagination. For this section, composed in a different key, concerned with entities more universal than the human, entities which do not need human life, but, affecting everything, affect human life too, inexorably and yet as if heedlessly, is not a real transition from the first section to the last, both conceived in human terms, but something outside them. The time which passes in this interval passes not for the characters in the story, but for everything. It is a natural, an astronomical, a cosmical transition, and not a human one, except incidentally, and the result is that when Mrs. Woolf returns to the human plane, the sequence seems doubly abrupt. We are not only transported from James's childhood to his youth, we are switched from one dimension of time to another. That this was not the right means to mark the flight of time in this place is shown, I think, by the effect of the 3rd section, for that effect is not intensified. It is, if anything, lessened by what has gone immediately before. Yet one cannot regret that Mrs. Woolf wrote the 2nd section in this book. For imagination and beauty of writing, it is probably not surpassed in contemporary prose. But how this kind of imagination can be applied, as one feels sure it can, to the business of the novelist, the shadowing forth of human life, is still a problem to be solved. End of Part 6. Part 7 of Contemporary Reviews of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Woman as Artist by Mary M. Collum, From the New York Herald Tribune, Sunday, 8th of May, 1927. Despite her modernity, Virginia Woolf is the best living example of that sort of mind which had its innings in letters in the 18th century. A mind partly critical, partly philosophical, highly imaginative, incapable of the vaster emotions, but so subtle in its emotionalized intellectuality, so polished, that it makes most other contemporary writers appear to be parvenus of the intellect, stumbling self-consciously under their knowledge and their cleverness. "Women can't write, women can't paint," says a character in her newest book, and the crabbed and cranky expression arrests one as one proceeds slowly through this leisurely, melancholy, whimsical book. This book by a woman who, in a few years, has become one of the foremost living English novelists, who indeed of all contemporary English novelists has the most high-bred, the most accomplished mind. Her intellect is as natural to her as the colour of her hair and the shape of her hands. It gives a sinewy nervousness to her style, a glamour to her learning, and a queer reality to her ideas. We feel that, although her heart may be deceived sometimes, her intellect never is. She is not a modern in the sense that Joyce is a modern, a lightning flash in the sky, obvious and visible to all. She is modern in the sense that she is a natural development from everything that has gone before. Everything that is in her can be traced to some germ that has already appeared in English literature or English thought. She is not, then, startlingly new. She wants to do nothing very daring with literature. She would be justly horrified if it were suggested that she was trying to cross it with another art or with science, as Joyce may be said to be doing. However, on the side of her modernity, she has one thing that is common to the three most modern of contemporary novelists, Joyce, Proust, and the later George Moore. Her books belong to the literature of memory. She has written half a dozen novels and a couple of books of criticism, all of unique distinction. Her novels on the whole are more important than her purely critical books, though her criticism is extraordinarily fine and profound, if somewhat narrow in its range. She is too British to quite understand the Russians, or perhaps too regularized in her emotions. But who in our time has interpreted Jane Austen so well? Who, in so few words, has shown us clearly the barbarism of H.G. Wells, whose very generosity of sympathy seems to add to his grossness? Who has brought so clearly to our attention that though the characters of Arnold Bennett live abundantly and unexpectedly, we never know exactly how they live or what they live for? Who among our modern writers has stood more firmly for the interior life, more convincingly for scholarship without pedantry, for culture without genteelness? Who has stood out more broad-mindedly, more proudly for the civilization that has been handed down to us, as against the shocking crudenesses and the more shocking genteelnesses that are invading us, and invading us particularly in America? As she herself says of Addison, she is on the side of sense, taste, and civilization. No book of critical essays really surpasses her common reader in just those qualities, sense, taste, and civilization. She has unvarying vigour and soundness, even when she is bewildered, as she sometimes is about contemporary literature. Ulysses and the portrait of the artist will never cease to be a puzzle to her, even though she admits that as compared with Mr. Wells's materialism, they stand for spirituality, and her little pamphlet, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, which appeared in this paper, is really only incidentally enlightening, for the reason that to the sort of modern literature which has its springs outside of the class to which she belongs, she is a bewildered outsider. The world that she understands is university bred, and probably English university bred at that. But how original are her essays on Jane Austen and Joseph Addison! How profound her understanding of them, and how easily do we perceive that she herself is a development from them. In her essay, The Russian Point of View, How completely does she express the puzzlement of a descendant of Addison and Jane Austen as to these Russians who can say with such simple conviction to any fellow man, brother, who so easily understand everything with the heart, and who seem to make of the head only a handmaiden. Although outside of Shakespeare there is no more exciting reading for her than Dostoevsky, it is characteristic of her, characteristically English, that it is Tolstoy whom she really likes. It is also characteristic of her, as it is characteristic of the particular English intellectual class to which she belongs, that she has almost no prejudices. To write of any novel of hers without taking her critical powers into account is impossible, for hers is the critical mind turned onto fiction. She is in a way like one of those graceful French précieuses of the 18th century, who turned an investigating mind on life and letters. In this new book of hers, To the Lighthouse, she has invented a way of writing fiction that is a cross between Madame de Sévigne's letters and Addison's De Coverley papers. So frequently are the characters of her books intellectuals, or people whose main interests are intellectual, that we get the same impression as we get when we read her criticism of the flashlight of the intellect being turned on life and on a few human beings, which are then revealed to us with a bright reality. Her people, in spite of their domesticity and their large families, seem hardly at all concerned in that major occupation of humanity, passing on life to other people, or even with the minor occupations that are incident to this. They seem to be concerned chiefly with something that is happening in their minds. Her women characters are all intellectuals, even when they aren't in the least erudite, passing their lives in reverie, as intellectual women so frequently do in old countries, dreaming their lives away, not bustling on to some sort of achievement as they do in America. For this reason her women are all fascinating, with a fascination that the intellectual woman has always had in real life, when her intellect and her learning are an integral, unassumed part of her, and do not stand out with the obviousness and the prickliness of quills on a porcupine. She can portray as no other living writer can these charming modern intellectual women, mysteriously sunk into themselves, revolving within their minds the mysteriousness of life, like Mrs. Ramsay in To the Lighthouse, feeling alone with her old protagonist, life. All of them are disappointed in some way, all unhappy in some way, as perhaps everybody is in this world who is not a clod of earth. They can be affectionate mothers, absorbed mothers, but they seem to be mothers incidentally, in spite of the children who are forever hanging on to their skirts, being read to, being soothed, being petted. Virginia Woolf can create, like no other writer, an atmosphere of cultivated English domesticity, that family life which is so different from American family life, and which is in so many respects common to all old countries. That English family life where everybody is a distinct and separate individuality with his own reserves, his own private happinesses and unhappinesses, his own interior life, his own loneliness. A household where there are doors to every room that close tightly, and where people do not casually call each other by their Christian names. Within this family life her people are all natural and have no attitudes. But we who have a private life and hold it infinitely the dearest of our possessions, she writes in one of her critical essays, suspect nothing so much as an attitude. Directly we begin to protest, to attitudinize, to lay down laws, we perish. We are living for others, not for ourselves. In this new book of hers, To the Lighthouse, she takes the family of the Ramsays in their summer home in the Hebrides, and displays them in their everyday lives and occupations. There is their guest, Lily Briscoe, there is their guest, Mr. Tansley, who used to keep saying, "Women can't write, women can't paint." There is old Mr. Carmichael, who knew strange Oriental languages, and had written poetry about the desert and the camel, to which nobody had paid any attention for 40 years, and then suddenly everybody began to talk about it. Then there are the 8 Ramsay children, and Mr. Ramsay, all of whom seem somehow to be intolerable interruptions to the reveries of Mrs. Ramsay. There is James, who always wanted to stick a knife in his father, Prue, who was so beautiful, Rose, who was so wonderful with her hands, Jasper, who would shoot the birds, Nancy and Roger, who were so wild, Andrew, who had a talent for mathematics, Cam, who was always made happy by a tenpenny doll's tea set. There was Mr. Ramsay himself, who, when he was young, had written one little book that was a contribution to human thought, and since that, many books which were not quite so good, so that he was for ever harassed with the fear that nothing he wrote would live after him. We see him in the eyes of his children an egoist, in the eyes of Mrs. Ramsay and Lily Briscoe, always looking for sympathy. The first part of the book is the reverie of Mrs. Ramsay, the last part the reverie of Lily Briscoe, and the difference between the content of the minds of these two women, of their types of mentality, is really a triumph of creative skill. Lily Briscoe is so kind-hearted, in love with all the Ramsays, a little in love with everyone, all her mental processes commonplace, with the occasional highfalutin intellectualities of the intelligent commonplace mind. Lily is always trying to paint, struggling for some raison d'être for her painting. One wanted to be on a level with ordinary experience, to feel simply, that's a chair, that's a table, and at the same time, it's a miracle, it's an ecstasy. So mumbles Lily to herself, and we are made to know, as if the knowledge was wafted to us on air, that nothing ever was or ever will be a miracle to Lily. We see her complacently laying down her brush at the end, saying to herself, "I have had my vision." It is the very last sentence in the book, and Mrs. Ramsay has been dead for years and years, for over half the book, but that last sentence of Lily's, more than anything else, makes us realise the marvellous distinction of Mrs. Ramsay, and fills us with an intolerable loneliness for that rare and beautiful mind of Mrs. Ramsay, who, with all the 8 children around her, had that habit of saying to herself, "What have I done with my life?" and that other habit of feeling alone with her old protagonist, life. The actual happenings up to the lighthouse, such as the death of Mrs. Ramsay or Andrew being killed in the war, are related in short sentences in brackets, to avoid, as it were, interrupting the flow of the reveries and the stream of life, which, as in our actual daily existence, goes on somehow, no matter what happens. The life of the Ramsays seems to be all Mrs. Ramsay, and then, with Mrs. Ramsay dead, life somehow goes on, incredibly goes on without her. The middle section of the book, called Time Passes, is so exquisitely written that it is, as it were, spun out of fire and air, out of wind and water, and has the intangible beauty of a long, highly sustained poem. Take the description of the little winds of night-time that roam through the Ramsay household when all are in bed and asleep. Nothing stirred in the drawing-room or in the dining-room or on the staircase. Only through the rusty hinges and swollen sea-moistened woodwork, certain airs, detached from the body of the wind, the house was ramshackle after all, crept round corners, and ventured indoors. Almost one might imagine them, as they entered the drawing-room, questioning and wondering, toying with the flap of hanging wallpaper, asking, would it hang much longer, when would it fall? Then, smoothly brushing the walls, they passed on musingly, as if asking the red and yellow roses on the wallpaper whether they would fade. So, some random light directing them with its pale footfall upon stair and mats from an uncovered star, or wandering ship, or the lighthouse even, the little airs mounted the staircase and nosed round bedroom doors, upon which, wearily, ghostlily, as if they had feather-light fingers and the light persistency of feathers, They would look once on the shut eyes and the loosely clasping fingers, and fold their garments wearily and disappear. At length, desisting, all ceased together, gathered together, all sighed together, all together gave off an aimless gust of lamentation, to which some door in the kitchen replied, swung wide, admitted nothing, and slammed to. Everything is the proper stuff of fiction, she says in her book of criticism, The Common Reader. Every feeling, every thought, every quality of brain. And so, out of every feeling, every thought, even out of the little airs, the little winds of night-time, she makes her fiction. She writes the subtle English of one whose ancestors for generations had made the language an easy garment with which to clothe their mind's expression. There are few living writers whose prose is so full of charm and whimsicality, and, at the same time, so direct and sincere because of her mind's reality, that reality which is, perhaps, the rarest of all mental endowments, and which makes her mind so peculiarly the mind of a critic. As we look down the list of her books, from the first one called The Voyage Out, which had a sort of spontaneity which she never quite captured again, we see that in each of them she had attained some unique, if quite ungaudy, distinction. We wonder at how good they are, and at the same time we cannot help wondering why they are not even better. We wonder not quite so much at why Virginia Woolf's books are not better. We wonder really why women's books in general are not better. How is it that so few women writers have ever climbed to that lofty peak where the greatest men writers are? Women can't write, women can't paint, says the cranky Mr. Tansley in this book of Virginia Woolf's. We know he is wrong, of course, yet we are harassed by his remark. Women can write, women can paint, but why have only 2 or 3 women in the history of literature ever reached to the stars, ever reached that height where strength of intellect and strength of feeling are so equally blended that they become one, that plane where heart and mind are both so powerful and so powerfully in tune that what one wills the other wills, that combination of both which produces not only the colossal things like the Divine Comedy and Antony and Cleopatra, but which gives small things like Drayton's Sonnets, The Parting, and Corey's Heraclitus, and Landor's past ruined Ilian Helen lives, such lasting and moving greatness. Why among women poets is it only Sappho who has achieved this thing, this sort of greatness, which we recognize at once in the few lines of her verse that are left to us, that something that made what she wrote not simply personal to herself, but so generally moving to all mankind that she has survived the ruin of Greece as Catullus has survived the ruin of Rome. If women had never entered the arts at all, many convincing reasons could be given which would entirely explain their abstention. But the difficult thing to explain is why, having entered the arts, they have so seldom scaled the heights or sounded the depths. They have achieved real solidity a few times, as in Jane Austen and George Eliot, but how often have the heights of ecstasy been attained by them? Perhaps only twice, once by a Greek woman who, if she had lived among us, would probably be an outcast sinner, and the other a forlorn Celt in exile on the Yorkshire moors. Why, when they want to write a love poem, do they babble little pseudo-pathetic verses like Christina Rossetti's "When I am dead, my dearest," full of self-pity and egoistic infantile emotions, without genuine reality? All the golden love letters have been written by women, says Havelock Ellis in one of his essays. This may be true, but all the golden love poems, nearly all the golden poems of any kind ever written, have been written by men. After all, the explanation may be simple, probably is simple, that circumstances refuse to permit women to become adults emotionally and intellectually. No emotion is grown up if it is one which merely turns you in on yourself. It is not really grown up unless it gives you a clue to something in the universe. Not very many grown human beings are really adults. Very few think like adults. Still fewer feel like adults. It has been both the pain and the privilege of the great artists that they were adults in both mind and heart, that they had the potentiality of experiencing life to the full. What is experience of life for one person may not be experience for another. However, we do know that while what are called the universal experiences may for one sort of person mean exactly nothing at all, for another the simplest event, like breaking a leg or reading a book, may be the clue to the mysteries of the universe. All the pathetically adolescent, ungrown-up faces we see in the subway or on the street are the faces of men and women who have been through what are called the great commonplaces of life. They may have known them all, but life itself they have never known. There is a substitute for almost everything else, a substitute for love, a substitute for happiness, a substitute for fame, but for life itself there is no substitute. Women have always been offered by men the universal experiences, but it is because these have too rarely meant life that so few women have been great artists. But what life is, that is the secret that is so hard to know. But there is one thing we do know about it, that when any man or woman captures it and gives it to us in the shape of a poem or a story or a picture, in no matter what small degree, we respond to it with our whole being. When it is given to us in a large degree, whole generations of men respond to it, and the giver is rewarded with immortal fame. End of Part 7. Part 8 of Contemporary Reviews of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An Allegorical Novel by Francis Brown. From the Daily Herald, 23rd May 1927. The editor sat in his chair with his usual cheerful smile. His voice was low, but his speech was fair, and apparently void of guile. "Write, a review of this book," said he, and plunged me deep in a woeful plight, with my limited brain, ah me! Words, that jostle and gallop and rush, words, an intangible mystical mush, words till I sit and stare, like one in a darksome dream, groping about in a region where verbosity reigns supreme. A tale of an egotist, of his wife, with a mind to give, of their children 8, and of guests a list. But none of them seemed to live, for nothing they seemed to yearn, save the husband and praise he sought, and little they did, but we read and learn the myriad things they thought. Thoughts, that off at a tangent fly, with life dragged in by the scruff of its neck, with its how and what and why. Thoughts that wander about in a weird parenthetical style, with meanings enmeshed in a web of doubt, till their finding is scarce worth while. The story is told with vim, with a fevered violent stress. Its moral, however, is more than dim, to me, as I must confess. But if I, with a mild amaze, found the task of reading it hard, Mrs. Woolf, no doubt, will account it praise, for I'm but a doggerel bard. End of Part 8. Part 9 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From the Editor Recommends, The Bookman, July 1927. Of Virginia Woolf, much has been written, and rightly too. When the chaff of this century's writing blows away, we shall probably find that her contribution to the development of the novel is far greater than we at present realise. To the Lighthouse is in some ways a simpler and more beautiful book than Mrs. Dalloway. Its flights of imaginative writing strike me as more vivid. I didn't enjoy it so well, and I'm blessed if I know why. Perhaps I shall discover a year from now on a rereading, and it doesn't matter much anyhow, since it is a fine and a readable book. I should like to quote a paragraph as an example of this exquisite and distinguished style. But what, after all, is one night? A short space, especially when the darkness dims so soon, and so soon a bird sings, a cock crows, or a faint green quickens like a turning leaf in the hollow of the wave. Night, however, succeeds to night. The winter holds a pack of them in store, and deals them equally, evenly, with indefatigable fingers. They lengthen, they darken. Some of them hold aloft clear planets, plates of brightness. The autumn trees, ravaged as they are, take on the flash of tattered flags, kindling in the gloom of cool cathedral caves, where gold letters on marble pages describe death in battle, and how bones bleach and burn far away in Indian sands. The autumn trees gleam in the yellow moonlight, in the light of harvest moons, the light which mellows the energy of labour, and smooths the stubble, and brings the wave lapping blue to the shore. End of Part 9. Part 10 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Unsigned Review from the English Review, 1927. In observation and mastery of prose, Mrs. Woolf ranks very high. She could be among our foremost novelists, but she prefers to exploit a theory of writing which leaves her story nowhere, important incidents being summarized in brackets, as if they were a tedious necessity. The lighthouse which provides the title is the aim of a trip by sea which attracts the Ramsay family. It is proposed, put off, and not achieved till the end of the book, when Mrs. Ramsay is dead. Her character is a fine achievement. At 50, with hollow cheeks and white hair, she is still beautiful, still strangely attractive, and round her revolve various persons, including her husband, a mooning professor blind to ordinary things, and, in spite of his egoism, inspiring pity and gratitude in his wife. She looks after the shabby seaside house and their host of children. The important moments of the book come in obscure, broken hints, attempts to recapture the meaning, which, for no reason at all, as perhaps they are stepping out of the tube or ringing a doorbell, descends on people, making them symbolical, making them representative. This transcendence of symbols is pictured in a deliberately interrupted style, meant somehow to reproduce it. End of Part 10. Part 11 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Unsigned Review from the New Age, 8th of September, 1927. Mrs. Woolf takes such a long time to reach her blooming lighthouse. She herself has to divide the pilgrimage into the getting there and the being there, that we soon lost patience with her carefully drawn golders-greenish wanderers on the shore. It gives such a handle to the there-you-are-then type of literary tradesman to have to confess that conscientious and high-minded authors like these latter-day Hogarths of ours never seem to get anywhere, but take up all the time talking about it. There is, after all, such a thing as a reader's Magna Charta, one of the clauses in which is that something ought to happen at some time in a book, or we ought to get our money back. With all due respect, it must be said that it is lucky there are not more publishers with a mission and the cacoethes scribendi. They can be, mind you, they're not as a rule, heaven forbid, just as bad in their way as the rot-gut merchants of Paternostralia, who hope to recoup in some blind lucky swipe all the money they lose every year on the grisly rubbish they try to sell by fishing in the broad stream of pornography. But how terrible that the contemplation of such a decent and efficient person as Mrs. Wolfe should lead us to any such reflections. End of Part 11. Part 12 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From a review of new fiction by C.S. and M.A. in the Bookshelf, June 1927. Among the most distinguished novels of last year was the dazzling portrait of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. With its publication, Mrs. Woolf stood forth as perhaps the cleverest and most successful exponent of that new school of fiction which builds a story out of the thought, the feeling, the reactions of the characters. In a word, out of their full stream of consciousness, instead of by the author's objective treatment. Although any work from the pen of Mrs. Woolf merits attention because of its significance to the trend of writing and its influence on young authors, she trips in her new book, To the Lighthouse, into the bog where so many of this modern school have floundered. She tries so hard for such fine shades of feeling, for such nice nuances of thought, that her meaning grows blurred. Furthermore, To the Lighthouse does not concern a single character, but the large heterogeneous Ramsay family, wife, husband, 8 children, and sundry visitors. In the first part, all are seen at a house party at the Ramsays' summer home in the Hebrides. Then 10 years pass, during which the house stands empty. After these years are over, and after Mrs. Ramsay's death, the family returns to its summer home, where still the shadow of Mrs. Ramsay dominates her husband, her children, and their friends. At times Mrs. Ramsay, who is the central figure, emerges as a real person, but to keep alive a whole group by such delicate means as the play and interplay of thought and feeling is too difficult a task even for the expert Mrs. Woolf. Yet her style remains exquisite and triumphant. End of Part 12. Part 13 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From Books and Persons by Arnold Bennett. The Evening Standard, 23rd of June 1927. Last week I discussed some recent reading in verse. I will now mention some new fiction for which I then had no room. I must begin by saying that, as regards fiction, I exist in a state of excited suspense, waiting, in hope and in apprehension, for Galleon's Reach, the first novel of H. M. Tomlinson. Tomlinson, as some have been for years aware, is a great prose writer. He is, to use a convenient but of course misleading description, an English Conrad. I have been hearing about this novel for a long time, and at last I hear that it is being printed. It is certain to contain exceedingly fine work. It may be an exceedingly fine novel, none can tell. For those to whom English literature matters, the moment is anxious. While impatiently attending Tomlinson, I have read a bunch of novels. I must say, despite my notorious grave reservations concerning Virginia Woolf, that the most original of the bunch is To the Lighthouse, Hogarth Press. It is the best book of hers that I know. Her character drawing has improved. Mrs. Ramsay almost amounts to a complete person. Unfortunately, she goes and dies, and her decease cuts the book in two. Also, there are some pleasing records of interesting sensations outside the range of the ordinary novelist. The scheme of the story is rather wilful, designed seemingly, but perhaps not really, to exhibit virtuosity. A group of people plan to sail in a small boat to a lighthouse. At the end, some of them reach the lighthouse in a small boat. That is the externality of the plot. The middle part, entitled Time Passes, shows a novel device to give the reader the impression of the passing of time, a sort of cataloguing of intermediate events. In my opinion, it does not succeed. It is a shortcut, but a shortcut that does not get you anywhere. To convey the idea of passage of a considerable length of time is an extremely difficult business, and I doubt if it can be accomplished by means of a device, except the device of simply saying, "Time passes," and leaving the effort of imagination to the reader. Apart from this honest shirking of the difficulty, there is no alternative but to convey the impression very gradually, without any direct insistence in the manner of life itself. I have heard a good deal about the wonders of Mrs. Wolfe's style. She sometimes discovers a truly brilliant simile. She often chooses her adjectives and adverbs with beautiful felicity. But there is more in style than this. The form of her sentences is rather tryingly monotonous, and the distance between her nominatives and her verbs is steadily increasing. Still, To the Lighthouse has stuff in it strong enough to withstand quite a lot of adverse criticism. End of Part 13. Part 14 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cauldron of Perception by Zona Gale. From the Saturday Review of Literature, 25th of June, 1927. If Virginia Woolf has not made a contribution to the novel of the future, it will be because the future shall arrive at the same essence of novel by another method. Some notion was in both of them, she says, about the ineffectiveness of action, the supremacy of thought. It is at this notion that she has arrived, and it lies implicit in her novels, and never more surely so than in To the Lighthouse. Through 300 pages there streams the current of the thought, directed, subconscious, accidental, tremendous, of half a dozen quite average human beings. All that actually happens, namely the death of the central character and 2 of her children, goes into parentheses of from 2 to 4 lines. The on-sweeping stream of the book has to do with these average living ones, looking out from an interior unknown to them onto exteriors equally unknown, all of these being cauldrons of perception, memory, and associative awareness, and not in event, she seems to say, but in this thunderous drama lies life, the life of life, the essence of fiction, the stuff of a novel. This is far more than the stream of consciousness. In the one book of Dorothy Richardson's which I have read, Pointed Roofs, Miss Sinclair, in her introduction, defines this novel as one consisting of that which Miriam sees and feels, uttered precisely as she sees and feels it, and as consisting of no more. There the stream is swift, flat, defined, self-evidential. Mrs. Wolfe carries all this into another domain, a domain not of impression, but of a deeper perception, of actual spiritual contact with personality, relationship, speculation, and irrelevance. Her art consists in thus touching toward trail, peak, ray, and every such release the reader is challenged to follow. Following, he finds his own in personality, relationship, speculation, irrelevance, or he does not find these. Either he too creates as he reads, or he does not create. Thus for fiction Mrs. Wolfe is doing what Stravinsky does for the orchestral. Both are shifting the area of participation. For me the charm of To the Lighthouse is beyond all words, but one ought to be careful to whom one says this. Not to one who would stare if you mentioned that the book begins in the afternoon with a projected trip to the lighthouse, and that nearly 200 pages later falls twilight of the same day with the trip abandoned. and that more than 100 pages, and 10 years later, the book ends just as the lighthouse island is reached. But to mention this outline is beside the point, is irrelevant to the book, is treacherous, is, in fine, a comment in a dimension other than the book's dimension, since in the rushing consciousness of those few people summering in the Hebrides, there have taken place innumerable excursions through all the apparently static which is found to be beating and pulsating with life. For in action Mrs. Wolfe has found that which science has discovered for the inorganic, that there is no such thing. One can quote from the book for the pleasure of the ordinarily dimensioned, but, like wildflowers brought into the house, these are then unintegrated and reveal nothing of the meadow dimension. That community of feeling with other people which emotion gives, as if the walls of partition had become so thin that practically the feeling was one of relief and happiness. It was all one stream, and chairs, tables, maps were hers, were theirs, it did not matter whose, and Paul and Minter would carry it on when she was dead. Besides, she knew, directly she came into the room, that the miracle had happened. She wore her golden haze. Sometimes she had it, sometimes not. She never knew why it came or why it went, or if she had it. Yes, tonight she had it, tremendously. She knew that by the way Mr. Ramsay told her not to be a fool. She sat beside him, smiling. Sitting opposite him, could she not see, as in an X-ray photograph, the ribs and thigh bones of the young man's desire to impress himself, lying dark in the mist of his flesh, that thin mist which convention had laid over his burning desire to break into the conversation? Phrases came, visions came, beautiful pictures, beautiful phrases, but what she wished to get hold of was that very jar on the nerves, the thing itself before it has been made anything. "Get that and start afresh. Get that and start afresh," she said desperately, pitching herself firmly again before her easel. No quotation avails. The distinction lies here. A spoonful of brine gives the flavour of the barrel, but a spoonful of the sea at sunset, what of that? The method now is of sufficient importance to enspell one for the space of a volume. Can such a method be integrated, permitting both action and inaction to take their places in a novel, as in life, events too being played upon by pulsation, as in this book Mrs. Wolfe plays upon that which we have been accustomed to call monotony? Why not? For this method, like the methods of all literature, is a quest. Meanwhile, To the Lighthouse moves towards the core of life in letters. End of Part 14. Part 15 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From Notes on Recent Books by Elizabeth Brown Cutting. North American Review, June to August 1927. Genius in this most recent novel of Mrs. Virginia Woolf finds us in a different case altogether. Here one parts with Miss Drew's view, certainly, for there is scope in this novel To the Lighthouse as wide as the sea itself, which beats its listless chime all through the pages and makes the rhythm of this strangely moving story. The Ramsay family live by the sea. James Ramsay, aged 6, the youngest of 8 children, is promised by his beautiful mother that the next day they will go to the lighthouse, a day's sail away. The father, a sort of male Cassandra, says it will rain. This is his view about everything, except his own books on metaphysics. 2/3 of the book is given over to the evening, already spoiled for James by that insistence about rain, wherein one learns by most delicate traceries of this family of Ramsays and their guests. The next part. Time has passed. Changes have come. The family have not been back to the sea. At the end, some of them do come. James, indeed, now a lad of 16, sails his father to the lighthouse. Scarcely more than this, out of which Virginia Woolf, with stroke after stroke, has fashioned such a fragment of beauty. At random one could choose passages that are like bits of still life. Now 8 candles were stood down the table, and after the first stoop, the flames stood upright and drew with them into visibility the long table entire, and in the middle a yellow and purple dish of fruit. What had she done with it? Mrs. Ramsay wondered, for Rose's arrangement of the grapes and pears, of the horny pink-lined shell, of the bananas, made her think of a trophy fetched from the bottom of the sea, of Neptune's banquet, of the bunch that hangs with vine leaves over the shoulder of Bacchus in some picture, among the leopard skins and the torches lolloping red and gold. In The Common Reader we learned of Mrs. Wolfe's critical gift. In Mrs. Dalloway, as well as in To the Lighthouse, we find that proper use of the economy of means, which, however, in the hands of some novelists, so easily becomes parsimony in literature. Mrs. Wolfe is an artist, and a rarely gifted one. End of Part 15. Part 16 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From Mr. Chesterton and Others by Gerald Gould. The Observer, 15th of May, 1927. Mrs. Wolfe is never dull. She has, to an extraordinary degree, the power to make ordinary incident and atmosphere exciting. In her latest novel, she presents a household which her description of it renders thrilling. The famous but difficult husband, the beautiful middle-aged wife, the 8 restless children, the visitors incongruous and inept. She catches them on holiday, and for about 2/3 of the volume displays them in tiny domestic scenes, touching off their varying moods ironically and beautifully. Then in a few pages she scrambles through 10 years, kills the beautiful mother, kills a son in the war and a daughter in childbed, and then again, thirdly, takes her family, diminished in numbers and vitality, to the scene of the original holiday, and dispatches some of them on that visit to the lighthouse which was planned 10 years before. The insight into character is amazing, and yet, perhaps, it is insight into mood rather than into the permanent character that suffers the mood. The story is a series of brilliant pictures, some more brilliant, some less. It does not compose into a unity, and perhaps the something wrong here is a style that frequently defeats its own natural beauty on a theory, a style that goes tumbling from comma to comma, from semicolon to semicolon, in a hopeless attempt to keep pace with flying time. The story remains memorable, almost as much for its defects as for its charms. It is full of exquisite touches. I like particularly the thought of Mrs. Ramsay presiding with immutable calm over destinies which she completely failed to understand. End of Part 16. Part 17 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lyrical Fiction, an unsigned review from the Glasgow Herald, 26th of May, 1927. There is an elusive quality in Mrs. Wolfe's work, which is so different from anything else in literature as to be quite indefinable. If she must be labelled, it should be rather as a lyrical poet than as a novelist. Her new novel has no plot, and its free rambling style, with none of the firmness and concision of prose, yet has a rhythm which makes it more akin to poetry, and particularly to modern poetry. She enters completely into her characters, one by one, and traces their thoughts and actions with free lyrical expression. Noticing the most trivial detail, she invests it with significance, but it is always the significance which it assumes in the mind of the character. Mrs. Wolfe never for a moment becomes the detached observer of the world which she is creating, therefore her people are entirely real without ever being tangible. The lyrical quality of her work is the more pronounced when she is dealing with inanimate objects. The short central part of the book, in which she indicates the passage of time in the empty house where her characters have been and will be again, is sheer poetry, filled with beautiful lyrical imagery. It is Mrs. Ramsay, erect and busy with her calm beauty, who permeates the whole story. We follow her reactions, to her husband, overbearing and helpless, the philosopher and egotist, to her children and to her guests assembled in a house in Skye, and they in turn interact and react to her. The last part of the book, stationary like the first, looks back across the bridge of time and stretches out to the spirit of the first. Mrs. Ramsay is dead, but the characters, or such as remain, still feel her pervading influence. There is beauty in the conception of this influence, through which the dead still live. There is one thing in this book which, though it may seem unimportant, calls for protest. Remoteness from the world was of course essential to Mrs. Wolfe's theme, but this does not justify her action in describing a place which is very obviously Cornwall and calling it Skye. Having chosen Skye as the scene of her story, she has depicted a country which has an absurd lack of resemblance to the west coast of Scotland. This, however, is a small matter in a book which confirms the impression that Mrs. Wolfe is not merely the most original, but the most interesting of imaginative writers. End of Part 17. Part 18 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nothing is simply one thing. Virginia Woolf's surprising new story by Lydia Languish. From John O'London's Weekly, 11th of June, 1927. Surprise is always an ingredient of Mrs. Wolfe's work. In the presentation of facts, in punctuation, in parentheses, she is a law unto herself. This lends to any book by her a certain excitement. One knows before one begins that her realities will be mysterious, and her mysteries real. To the Lighthouse is no exception. Her lighthouse, for instance, is a real object, stark and straight, barred with black and white, windows in it, washing spread on the rocks to dry, but it is more essentially a spiritual goal, never reached until all the youthful glamour of it had faded for the boy James Ramsay. The Ramsays were a remarkable family, rotating almost without knowing it round the personality of Mrs. Ramsay, who was mother of 8 children, still more definitely the wife of her vain, irascible, yet lovable husband, but most of all, unassailably, Mrs. Ramsay herself. The beautiful mother. Mr. Tansley, one of those tiresome people whose snobbery takes the form of telling everyone how lowly born they are, was a guest at the cottage in Skye, where the Ramsays spent their summers. Because nobody liked him, Mrs. Ramsay took him to town with her when she went shopping, and he made the discovery that this woman of 50, the mother of 8 children, was the most beautiful person he had ever seen. He took her bag and, seeing a man digging a drain, paused to look at her. He knew for the first time in his life the extraordinary pride of walking with a beautiful woman. Between Mrs. Ramsay and her youngest child, James, a great sympathy existed. They were comfortable together. With Mr. Ramsay nobody was ever comfortable. Even Lily Briscoe, the determined spinster and completely inefficient artist who was in love with the whole family, was obliged to excuse him in her own mind, by thinking that a man whose life study was subject and object and the nature of reality could not be judged like an ordinary person. He was petty, selfish, vain, egotistical, a tyrant who wore his wife to death, but he had a fiery unworldliness. Will it be fine tomorrow? The family and their 2 or 3 guests are all astoundingly alive, although the comedy in which their parts are cast has little more substance than the simple question, will it be fine tomorrow? The attitude of his elders towards the meteorological situation stamps James's opinion of their characters for all time. Mrs. Ramsay, for James's sake, saw no reason why it shouldn't be. Mr. Ramsay was certain that it won't, and the disagreeable Mr. Tansley rubbed it in. The pessimists had it, and when finally it was settled that another picnic had succumbed to the British climate, one has reached the middle of the book. For a few pages one fears that something more precious has gone with it. A brief intimation in parentheses that Mrs. Ramsay had died suddenly the night before threatens to cut the thread which has hitherto held one spellbound. But with her peculiar power of investing the commonplace with subtleties, Mrs. Wolfe rearrests attention from a different quarter. Mrs. Ramsay dead, 2 of her children dead also, the charwoman got orders to prepare the house for the family's return. There is something reminiscent of the desolate habitation to which Mary Rose returned in the house in Skye as Mrs. MacNab the charwoman saw it.
This had been the nursery. Why, it was all damp in here. The plaster was falling. And the rats in all the attics. The rain came in, but they never sent, never came. Some of the locks had gone, so the doors banged. She didn't like to be up here at dusk alone, neither. It was too much for one woman. Too much, too much. She creaked, she moaned, she banged the door, she turned the key in the lock, and left the house shut up, locked, alone.
The return of Mrs. Ramsay. But now the family was coming back. Before any of them, Mrs. Ramsay came. It seems she has always been there. No one noticed her except Lily Briscoe, the artist and determined spinster. Even she was at first inclined to consider Mrs. Ramsay as faded and gone, but when she set up her easel on the lawn to try to recapture a certain vista of which the central point had been Mrs. Ramsay and James, she was struck painfully by the emptiness of the drawing-room steps. The physical sensations that went with the bare look of the steps had become suddenly extremely unpleasant. To want and not to have sent all up her body a hardness, a hollowness, a strain. "Oh, Mrs. Ramsay!" she called out silently, as if to abuse her for having gone, and then, having gone, come back again. Then, whilst Mr. Ramsay and his younger children set sail for the lighthouse at last, she had her vision. She seemed to be standing up to the lips in some substance, to move and float and sink in it. Yes, for these waters were unfathomably deep. Into them had spilled so many lives, the Ramsays, the children's, and all sorts of waifs and strays of things besides. A washerwoman with her basket, a rook, a red-hot poker, the purples and grey-greens of flowers, some common feeling which held the whole together. At the same moment James reached the lighthouse and realized that nothing is simply one thing. The lighthouse, for instance, was stark and white, but it was also a silvery, misty-looking tower with a yellow eye that opened suddenly and softly in the evening. Every page of this delightful book has its little nugget of pure gold. Mrs. Wolfe looks deeper into things than most people, and what she sees she offers with incomparable grace. Her opinion she shares with, instead of thrusting upon her readers, and what a relief that is! End of Part 18. Part 19 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Done in the Round by Mary Ross. From The Nation, 20th of July, 1927. Some writers can etch a character in a few sharp lines against white space. Others unroll a whole life in flat, bright patterns like a tapestry. Virginia Woolf has a unique manner of washing away the unessential as the sea sculptures a bit of broken glass, till the spirit emerges as simple, translucent, yet individual in the dignity of the loneliness which encompasses all consciousness. Her people are done in the round. They emerge until the reader becomes intensely aware of the essence which lies behind the apparent complexities and contradictions of civilized human beings, and they would fade away like the lost Eurydice before any attempt to ticket or classify them or brand them with a label. To the Lighthouse is the quiet story of an English family who are spending the summer in the Hebrides. There is Mrs. Ramsay, about whom the story pivots, as did their life. Mr. Ramsay, who wrote one good book when he was young, and ever after was corroded by anxiety lest he should do no more to carve his name into eternity. Their 8 children and their guests. Tansley, the conscientious atheist. Augustus Carmichael, poet and student of the Orient. Lily Briscoe, who tries to paint. William Banks, a meticulous widower, young Minter Doyle with a hole in the heel of her stocking, and Paul Rayleigh, who is to marry her before the book is over. If the day is fine, they are to go to the lighthouse in the morning. The first half of the story is the reverie of Mrs. Ramsay as she sits in the late afternoon with James, the youngest, beside her, soothing his anxiety about the weather as she soothes the petulance of her husband. One by one the others impinge upon her consciousness and find rest there without disturbing her own serene depths. It seems impossible that this family, these people, could live except through her. Then an interval. Time passes, suggests the years that are rolling on as the old house stands untenanted save by the little winds of summer and the great winter gusts. Here are 25 pages of as clear and beautiful high prose as are likely to distinguish many a publishing season. Bracketed sentences tell of the events which mark time with the family. One night Mrs. Ramsay died quite suddenly. Prue, eldest and loveliest of the children, is dead with her baby, and Andrew is killed in battle. And so it was, years later, and with an eternity of difference, that the trip to the lighthouse finally happened. Mr. Ramsay came back with Nancy and Cam and James, who had been the little boy who wanted it so badly, and commonplace, faithful Lily Briscoe was there again, and old Augustus Carmichael. Much of this second part of the book is the reverie of Lily, looking backward and still trying futilely to grasp the present. They all have gone on. They have gone their separate and self-charted ways, as Mrs. Ramsay went hers, lacking her consciousness, her integration, yet impelled by the common need to run their course. Mrs. Dalloway, the preceding novel by Virginia Woolf, is a similar study of one woman, done with unity of time and place and person. The somewhat freer method of this latest book adds richness without dimming the peculiar quality of luminous insight which characterizes all Mrs. Woolf's novels. She has the rare ability to distill an inner life in patience and repose, unclouded by prejudice, to write in exquisite prose cadences the poetry of the mind. End of Part 19. Part 20 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Poetic Fiction, Mrs. Virginia Woolf's Novel Experiment. From the Morning Post, 21st of June, 1927. If any reader of Mrs. Wolfe's book protests that it is not a novel, there is something to be said for the opinion. It has a physical scene in a house located on a Scottish coast, but it is laid wholly in the minds of the hosts and their guests. The human figures in it are not of tangible substance, but only the reflections of such given off by one another. It has a plan, but scarcely what is known as a plot. In the first of its 3 sections, James Ramsay, aged 6, is frustrated in a promised visit to the lighthouse, and in the last of them, he, now 16, makes out that expedition. That is all the action there is of firm outline. The middle section, which projects a picture of the passage of time in between, merely mentions in parenthesis the death of the boy's mother, the Mrs. Ramsay whose personality yet survives and is dominant to the last page. So far as there is any story, it is tucked away within brackets. There are no people in it beyond the shapes found in reported perceptions. A reader of novels may not unreasonably protest that To the Lighthouse is something quite different from the form that term assumes. What Mrs. Wolfe has done is to carry further than perhaps ever before the experiment of exhausting a fiction of its story circumstance, and making it a vessel of philosophical and poetical content. Her theme, in brief, is the contradictions in men and things which compose life's mystery, and how it can be solved by their reconciliation in our various experience. And this is illustrated and enriched by so much of story as remains, significant and trivial at one and the same time, as Mr. Ramsay, for example, was at one and the same time venerable and laughable. The fiction framework, slight as it is, determines the book's form. The author's elusiveness is ultimately held by the limiting shape of the vessel itself. Her speculations are contained by the fixed lines of the James and his lighthouse incident, and it is from her characters created in relation to that, the self-centred, tyrannical, dependent Mr. Ramsay, Mrs. Ramsay, so effective and pervasive, their children, Lily Briscoe and the other guests, all individual in their various virtue and absurdity, that she strikes beauty with a poet's perception. Significant trivialities. That is like a net caught in which all the trivialities of her invented situation acquire significance, and this significance is always reflected with the heightened emphasis of the mirroring character, while the expression responds in a curious kind of chanting writing. As, for example, when Lily, with Mr. Banks on the terrace, catches sight of the Ramsays, and
"So that is marriage," Lily thought. "A man and a woman, looking at a girl throwing a ball. That is what Mrs. Ramsay tried to tell me the other night," she thought, for she was wearing a green shawl, and they were standing close together, watching Prue and Jasper throwing catches. And suddenly, the meaning which, for no reason at all, as perhaps they are stepping out of the tube or ringing a doorbell, descends on people, making them representative, came upon them, and made them in the dusk standing, looking, the symbols of marriage, husband and wife. Then, after an instant, the symbolical outline which transcended the real figures sank down again, and they became as they met them, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, watching the children throwing catches. Whether or not it carries the book beyond the novel form, the experiment is justified by its results. End of Part 20. Part 21 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From Novels and Stories by M. Robinson, The New Adelphi, September 1927. What makes a novelist? We shall never learn to respect our real calling and destiny, said Scott, until we have taught ourselves to consider everything as moonshine compared with the education of the heart. If that is true of life, it is equally true of novel writing, and yet that knowledge of the human heart is only half the novelist's equipment. Without it he will never be a serious writer,
but with it alone he will be nothing but a serious writer. He must have the power so to absorb that knowledge into his very being, that when it issues forth again, it does so in independent, original forms, and that power is a heavenly gift, for lack of which, since no pains will enable a writer to acquire it, Mrs. Wolfe's latest novel, like all her others, remains the limpid reflection of her own exquisite and receptive mind, but not a piece of creative writing. She is a master analyst, and tries to create by taking the elements which her analysis has separated out, and combining them to build something new, but you can never, in that way, make the kind of homogeneous whole which alone is creatively new. That must be done by the rapid sureness of instinct, not the hesitant uncertainty of conscious thought. Contrast her method with that of Miss Mary Arden, who instinctively withdraws herself from the polished surface at which impressions are received, in order to write out of those subtler depths in which they are assimilated and fused together. Her materials are in consequence exactly blended into a self-existent whole, while Mrs. Wolfe's pudding is sent to the table half-cooked and indigestible. But let me make my point clear by examining Mrs. Wolfe's method in a particular direction, choosing one in which, owing to an organic defect, her initial impressions are imperfect. It happens that she is, as far as I can see, completely tone-deaf to colour, but since colour and sound are not things in themselves, but merely mediums by means of which the same thing may be expressed in different dimensions, it follows that anyone who is deaf to sound in colour, or blind to colour in sound, must express that thing in one dimension only, as a plane surface, and not in the round. And this incomplete colour sense of Mrs. Wolfe makes the faulty cohesions of her method glaringly conspicuous. In the middle, a yellow and purple dish of fruit. Rose's arrangement of the grapes and pears, of the horny pink-lined shell, of the bananas, made her think of a trophy fetched from the bottom of the sea, of Neptune's banquet, of the bunch that hangs with vine leaves over the shoulder of Bacchus in some picture, among the leopard skins and the torches lolloping red and gold. Contrast that with the effortless accuracy of a master of colour, such as Mr. D.H. Lawrence, for whom it is his natural element in which he moves free and sure. It is flat, opaque, inert, no depth, no changing lights, no warmth, no vibration. You feel that for her colour is simply paint without life or rhythm, and presently Lily is caught thinking to herself, beneath the colour there was the shape. It recurs, one colour melting into another like the colours on a butterfly's wing, but beneath the fabric must be clamped together with bolts of iron. You cannot paint a picture or write a novel with form and colour separated in this violent way. They are interpenetrative, and it is noteworthy that Mrs. Wolfe is at her best in such descriptions as that of the empty house, all twilight shadows and whispers, where there is no occasion for distinct form or decided colour, where since the whole is quite rightly one continuous slight tremolo, inaccuracy of pitch is not noticeable, as it is when a clear note, long and full, must be struck, and any departure from the exact middle of the note is discordantly apparent. And so with her human characters, she can portray their half-lights too, but definite individuality, whole, not half-thoughts, completeness, these are beyond her, and so her characters are all indeterminate, not alike, and yet indistinguishable, merging into each other in a fluid and stable way, so that you are never sure where one ends and another begins. End of Part 21. Part 22 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Unsigned Review from Punch, 20th of July 1927. Again into the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf pursues her desperately analytical fourth-dimensional manner which needs more concentration in the reader than most of us are perhaps willing or able to bring. The Ramsay family and their guests propose to visit a lighthouse. They don't because it rains. 10 years after, a war intervening and the beautiful Mrs. Ramsay having meanwhile died in one of the author's most casual parentheses, the widower and 2 of his children make the voyage. And that is all the story. The rest is a hunt for and delicate exposure of the springs of action, and the wayward thoughts of a baker's dozen of characters. It all betrays a fine intelligence and keen perceptions, but it is more subtle than lucid, and it is extremely easy to wander down one of the dark avenues of Mrs. Wolfe's terrific sentences and get completely lost, unless you have a Bloomsbury intelligence. The portraits of the lovely middle-aged Mrs. Ramsay and her distinguished, vain, impetuous husband are extremely well embroidered on the vague background. The general pattern emerges as they do in a jigsaw puzzle, undoubtedly an interesting, if an exacting, method. End of Part 22. Part 23 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From a review by F.W.K. in the Sewanee Review, July 1927. The Allinghams by May Sinclair, New York, The Macmillan Company, 1927, 368 pages. To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, New York, Harcourt, Brace and Company, 310 pages. These 2 novels invite comparison because they are both studies in family relationships, and because in their approach and manner they are so different. The Allinghams portrays one of those delightful English families familiar to us in such novels as The Hounds of Spring or Miss Sinclair's earlier Tree of Heaven. Each one of the 6 Allingham children is individualized from the outset, and each is carried into the crucial years of life and love. With so many heroes and heroines, the story lacks the concentration of Miss Sinclair's recent studies of a single character, nor is there one dominant motive, but rather an interweaving of several themes familiar to her readers. The hereditary neurotic strain works itself out in the lives of the children, impelling one to drink, another to madness, a third to poetry, but the others are untouched. Parental stupidities, too, condition some of them, but all save one escape frustration and find fulfilment in love. In her sketch of the poet whose search for beauty leads him to love of woman and at last to love of God, Miss Sinclair merges her familiar theme of the genius with her later philosophic idealism. Like most of her later novels, this story tells itself largely through skillful dialogue, but with few of those sharp staccato thrusts that lay bare the very souls of Mary Olivier and Harriet Frene. On the whole, the Allinghams, readable as it is, brings us no new tidings of Miss Sinclair's mind or art. To the Lighthouse, on the contrary, is difficult reading. Indeed, there are Proustian sentences in which Mrs. Woolf seems to be trying to make language do the impossible, to present everything at once. Yet out of the seeming welter there emerges a memorable personality in this picture of a large family party spending the summer in the Hebrides. Parents, 8 children, assorted guests. Most of the children are mere names. The whole story is focused on Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, their relations to each other, their influence on the others. And it is Mrs. Ramsay on whom the whole book converges. Just as in the marvellously imagined scene of the family dinner, it is Mrs. Ramsay alone whose power of sympathy merges all those separate beings into a group, composes their discords into harmony, creates of their fragmentary moods a moment complete and beautiful as a work of art. That scene with Mrs. Ramsay's spirit first mingling with it, then hovering above it, serene, resting on the thing that endures, on eternity, That scene is the climax of the book. What follows is aftermath, the passage of 10 years over the empty waiting house, the death of Mrs. Ramsay, told in a casual parenthesis, the return of the survivors, the effect on them of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, above all of Mrs. Ramsay, the recreating of Mrs. Ramsay's influence through the imaginations of the child and the guest who were closest to the secret of her creative power, the culmination of Lily's vision of Mrs. Ramsay. It was part of her perfect goodness, sitting knitting in her chair as she sat when the story opened. All this, though finely wrought, seems something of a tour de force. The life of the novel has died with Mrs. Ramsay. To the lighthouse, the expedition planned by Mrs. Ramsay, longed for by her little boy, frustrated by Mr. Ramsay's cruel prediction of bad weather, forms the opening episode. And to the lighthouse Mr. Ramsay goes at last, in memory of her desire, the lighthouse that had been through all the years part and symbol of her inner happiness. Pray heaven that the inside of my mind be not exposed. So pray Mrs. Ramsay's guests, and well may they pray, for to the lighthouse is a notable contribution to that understanding of Mrs. Brown, which Mrs. Wolfe once defined as the aim of the novel. End of Part 23. Part 24 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Review by John Sydenham from the Empire Review, July 1927. There is perhaps not meant to be any symbolism in Miss Wolfe's Lighthouse. It has a useful purpose, for round it centres the main story element of the novel. This, it is true, is not very obtrusive. The lighthouse appears at the beginning and the end, but for most of the time it is as inconspicuous as the plot of a review. The characters, however, must be brought onto the stage somehow, and the incident of the lighthouse is as good a device as any. It introduces us at once to the Ramsays. Mr. Ramsay is a university don of 60, with a reputation as a writer on metaphysics. He has his tolerated eccentricities. He mutters to himself. He relapses from joviality into forbidding silences. He is abrupt, overbearing, and has outbursts of violent temper. He is avid of flattery and morbidly sensitive about his position in the intellectual world. Mrs. Ramsay is a lively and beautiful woman of 50. She talks with whimsical exaggeration. When she says that the waves are 1,000,000 miles high, she means that the sea is a little rough. She is inconsequent, decisive, and apt suddenly to do slightly surprising things. Her mind is a rapidly moving succession of images. If she sees a rook with some of its feathers missing, she at once thinks of a seedy old gentleman in a top hat playing the horn in front of a public house. In her inner life she is scatterbrained and a daydreamer, but outwardly she is the capable mother of 8 children, the adroit manager of a difficult husband, the financial contriver for an expensive household, and a clever and charming hostess. She and her husband and their children and a party of friends are staying for the summer in a house on the coast in the north of Scotland. We have glimpses of the children, particularly of James. We meet him on the first page. He is 6 years old and is cutting out pictures from a store's catalogue. And Mrs. Ramsay, who has a special reason for keeping him occupied, is anxiously looking for something like a rake or a mowing machine, which, with its prongs and its handles, would need the greatest skill and care in cutting out. She finds what she wants in a picture of a pocket-knife with 6 blades. The rest of the grown-ups, however, are more prominent than the children. There is Lily Briscoe, a middle-aged painter who can form pictures in her mind with greater facility than on canvas. Her slight symptoms of old maidishness are shown without satire, and her visualizing brain is an important link between the other characters. She serves as a psychological chorus. We also see mumbling old Augustus Carmichael, the poet who takes opium, William Banks, the punctilious scientist who always travels with a manservant, Charles Tansley, a dogmatic young man with social awkwardness who is working for a fellowship, and Minter Doyle and Paul Rayleigh, a couple of lovers. These are the characters, and the lighthouse, when we meet them first, is in all their minds. It is a local landmark on a small island some miles out at sea, and there has been some talk of visiting it the next day by boat. The eager child mind of James has seized on this project with tenacity. The lighthouse is to him a wonder place, a mystery, the goal of an exciting adventure. Over what to the grown-ups is a simple outing, an excuse for a picnic, he has cast a romantic glamour. Life has nothing more marvellous to offer him than that he should visit the lighthouse. He must go. But after this excitement of anticipation, his father remarks that the weather won't be fine. James in that moment hates his father, for he knows that his father is always right. Mrs. Ramsay is comfortingly hopeful, but the others are sure that it will rain, and that the wind will make a landing at the lighthouse impossible. Poor James goes to bed miserable, and the next day is wet. The visit is put off. The holiday comes to an end. Other things happen, and James forgets the lighthouse. Mrs. Ramsay dies. One of her daughters marries and dies in childbirth. One of her sons is killed in the war. Paul and Minter's marriage is a failure. Augustus Carmichael becomes famous, and 10 years pass before James and some of the others visit the place again. The position is now reversed. Mr. Ramsay insists on making the expedition to the lighthouse. James is not interested, but he is forced to go, and has a thoroughly wretched day. The lighthouse is, therefore, the opening and closing device, but it is more than that. A doubling of effect is characteristic of Mrs. Wolfe's method. Actually, the story covers 2 days. The first day is when James is 6, the second is when he is 16. We have the details of those 2 days, but we have also several lives stretched out before us. We see what is obvious, a group of people spending a seaside holiday, but above that is a heightened world of imagery and beauty. And the lighthouse, which to the child was a silvery, misty-looking tower, and to the youth was merely a stark thing on a bare rock, which was not in the least attractive, is, after all, symbolic. It suggests overtones of meaning. Mrs. Wolfe is telling us about a family at the seaside, but she is also conveying to us a good deal about childhood and age, hopes and disillusions, effort and failure. She extracts from reality more than matter-of-factness. It is true that as a storyteller she makes use of non-realistic conventions, but all art has its conventions, and hers are as allowable as others. They are certainly justified on practical grounds, for in its sensitive perception, its exquisite descriptions, and its poignancy of theme, the novel is a masterpiece. It is the best thing that Mrs. Wolfe has done, and should be read not only as a delightful story, but as an indication of the new fields being developed by fiction. End of Part 24. Part 25 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Unsigned Review from the Bookman, 27th of July, 1927. We hope that all the readers who were troubled and confused by Jacob's Room, saddened and even a little confused by Mrs. Dalloway, will read To the Lighthouse. For here they will be neither troubled nor confused, and if they are saddened, their sadness will be filled with beauty. We hope too that all who care for English literature, but have somehow missed her other works, will read this, Mrs. Wolfe's masterpiece, and appreciate one of the most subtle and sensitive minds now expressing itself in the novel. Mrs. Wolfe's prose is written in the mood of poetry. She is intensely interested in the outsides of things, but only as they express the inner beauty, the hidden reality of the mystery we call life. She has never tried to reach her goal by easy or pedestrian methods. Her steed has always been Pegasus, winged and fiery, springing toward cloud-capped towers. She has tried to rule him in her own way, and has not always succeeded. Sometimes he has escaped with her where we could not follow. Sometimes she has missed her goal, but here she has mastered him. Her book is a poem in prose. Her difficult method, which shows us life through the minds of her characters, those minds in which emotion and thought are forever blending, changing with every impression of the senses, and changing those impressions to feelings and ideas, no longer seems to distort life, but to show it more intensely and clearly, like a landscape seen through the diminishing glass of a painter. To the Lighthouse is a study in the reactions of one temperament on another, the ebb and flow of feelings, especially of the feelings of her family and friends to Mrs. Ramsay, the beautiful, the masterful, the loving. Mrs. Ramsay, who is like a natural force, almost a personification of the beauty, the strange persuasion, the broken comfort of what we call nature. It is a study in the difficulties of love, of friendship. Beauty informs this book as the sunlight informs a summer's day, as a reflection fills the river with the green hillside. End of Part 25. Part 26 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mrs. Wolfe's Way, an unsigned review from Time Magazine, 30th of May, 1927. The story is divided into 3 parts. The first, situated like the other 2 in the Hebrides home of English family Ramsay, includes the hours of a summer day from mid-afternoon to bedtime. In it is regarded with an astute and penetrating scrutiny the character of Mrs. Ramsay as reflected in her children, guests, husband. In the second part, time passes.
The house was left. The house was deserted. It was left like a shell on a sandhill to fill with dry salt grains, now that life had left it. The long night seemed to have set in, the trifling airs, nibbling, the clammy breaths, fumbling, seemed to have triumphed. The saucepan had rusted, and the mats decayed. Toads had nosed their way in. Idly, aimlessly, the swaying shawl swung to and fro. Poppies sowed themselves among the dahlias. The lawn waved with long grass. Giant artichokes towered among roses. A fringed carnation flowered among the cabbages, while the gentle tapping of a weed at the window had become, on winter's nights, a drumming from sturdy trees and thorned briars, which made the whole room green in summer.
In the last glimpse, 10 years later, with Mrs. Ramsay and 2 of her children dead, the others undertake a last visit to the lighthouse. Like the music of a fugue, this movement touches the themes of the first, catches them in new cadences and changed echoes. The group of people for whom Mrs. Ramsay had been the axis whirl and drift like the specks of a nebula. In a curious key full of sharps, Author Wolfe produces the effect of an enormous change in life where little change is apparent. The significance of Author Wolfe's last novel, Mrs. Dalloway, was that her stream of consciousness method was not only startlingly original, but startlingly successful as well. Mrs. Dalloway observed the classic unities of drama, concentrating on one woman, one day in her life. Into the Lighthouse, the stream of consciousness technique is present as before, but its presence is subtler, more diffused. The author's scrutiny falls not on one but on many personalities. Now in her brilliant offensive on the human soul, she does not perpetrate an open advance. Weaving, stalking, spying from thickets, she discovers the nature of her prey. The actual capture she leaves to those who, reading her book, are her companions in the chase. The author, in her critical studies, the common reader, made it apparent that her analytical abilities outweighed her previous achievements in fiction. Jacob's Room, Night and Day. But Mrs. Dalloway and this book mark her as one who has not only mastered the novel, but extended its function. Mrs. Wolfe is the youngest daughter of the late Sir Leslie Stephen. She married Leonard Sidney Wolfe, literary editor of The Nation and Athenaeum, in 1912. They live at Hogarth House, an old place in Richmond, spending their quiet time alike at gardening and fine writing and printing. End of part 26. Part 27 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Review by VHF in Country Life, the 21st of May, 1927. Mrs. Wolfe's own journey has been like one to a lighthouse. In her first novels, up to the time of Jacob's Room, many of us saw nothing but a rudderless bark on a plunging sea. The bark had left the shore, it seemed to us, unprovisioned except for a number of sky-rockets, and was bound for some modern port of nothingness. But in Mrs. Dalloway, suddenly a tall object stood up in the featureless waters, and we perceived that it was a lighthouse, a thing once seen by Mrs. Wolfe from the shore, and thereafter determinedly sought. And now in this new novel she is there, and out of the darkness of majesty and magic shines, steady, pure, the light. There is no more a sense of purposelessness or loss of direction. Mrs. Wolfe is at the haven where she would be, and the voyage has amply justified itself. This, in her own words, is the haven. Phrases came, visions came, beautiful pictures, beautiful phrases, but what she wished to get hold of was that very jar on the nerves, the thing itself before it has been made anything. Get that and start afresh. She has started afresh, and she has got that. The book moves surely and with beauty among the deepest, most delicate motions of the human heart and spirit. There is no longer any obscurity, any lack of sequence, but there is a printer's edition of a full stop at the top of page 200 that mars one of the most effective sentences in the book, a sentence into which death crashes with all the desultoriness and shock of life itself. The early admirers of Mrs. Wolfe's work were right, and this notice is a public confession of previous error. End of part 27. Part 28 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Civilized People in Life and Fiction by Charles R. Walker. From The Independent, 28th of May 1927. Luckily, even a reviewer does not construct his picture of contemporary life solely from fiction. If he did, it would be monotonously barbaric. One has the impression from the bulk of recent novels that the civilized man or woman has ceased to exist. Certainly, man as a conventional being has lost his entrails and all the hemoglobin in his blood. He has been reduced to a kind of eunuch, or fanaticized into a fundamentalist against whom released egos, with or without psychology, disport. Yet it is a fact patent to observation that despite war and every variety of disintegration, thousands of persons preserve civilized values, and millions conventional ones. Mrs. Wolfe is interesting and significant for a number of reasons. One of them is that she writes about the souls of such people. She writes about them with a freshness of technique and a critical vitality that has won her a place with the moderns, with Joyce and with Proust. One might say this Englishwoman is the leading novelist of the civilized mind, especially the British variety. Think of the long procession of her men and women who possess brain fibre, of the Greek professor in The Voyage Out, who continued to edit Pindar methodically in the tropics, of the young lady in Night and Day, daughter of a famous English poet, who solved calculus problems secretly in her room. Recall the conventionally and unconventionally cultured men and women who move in and out of Mrs. Dalloway's drawing-room. And now, into the lighthouse, there is, as we would expect, the defiant and embarrassed student, Charles Tansley, who writes dissertations, Lily Briscoe, who paints, to be sure, somewhat secretly and badly, and Mr. Ramsay himself, admirable and half pitiable, who made a contribution to human knowledge when he was 25 years old. His later books haven't been quite as good. He has a magnificent mind, but unfortunately 8 children. It is a mark of a novelist of the first rank that his work can be intensively identified with a single group, class, or countryside, and yet not limited by it. Human emotions generally, and yours and mine, seem the more universal when seen through such an author because of the very narrowing of his material. It is of course a narrowing to the utterly, the instinctively known. It was so with Jane Austen, it is so with Virginia Woolf. How then is this woman, with her fresh and hardy delicacy of style, and with her themes about professors and cabinet ministers' wives and philosophy, a modern? Where is her kinship with the Irishman James Joyce and the Frenchman Marcel Proust? First, she is a modern in subject matter. Her intellectuals are modern, even when old-fashioned, and their creator infinitely aware of all the most contemporary things of the modern world. It is very hard to find any kind of thought or feeling of which Virginia Woolf, through her characters, is not intensely and very freshly aware. And in her manner of writing she dives, as Proust and Joyce have done, into the clear and turgid stream of mental consciousness. She brings up a different assortment of wish-thoughts and seashells in her net, however, and she translates them into a peculiarly personal language. A girl's falling out of love with a man, a baby's universe suffering coloration under the influence of the voice tones of the mother, the quality of intellectual courage, the feeling one has after a dance, the feeling one has after finishing the writing of a history of English literature, the love of 2 lonely people who love and continue lonely. These are some of the shells in the net. For all her writing in the modern way, in the stream of consciousness school, in every novel there is a story, not always told but always implicit. There are characters, poetry and suspense, for always there runs in Mrs. Woolf's blood the long tradition of English novel writing. She takes into her technique, or finds existence in it, fragments of Dickens' mind and Jane Austen's. Yet she is also in debt, and rather heavily, to the author of Ulysses. To the Lighthouse is done with roughly the same blend of technique that was employed in Mrs. Dalloway. The author succeeds almost uncannily in dipping into the deepest streams of reverie, as Proust might, yet moving the story faster, coming up oftener, and looking rapidly into one person's reverie and then into another's, often on the same page, as Joyce almost never does, and coming up completely every now and then for air and a declarative sentence. The first half of the book is the story of the Ramsays and their guests, Lily Briscoe who paints, and Charles Tansley who writes dissertations, and William Banks, a bachelor luxuriating in celibate egoism, and all the 8 children. Prue, for example, who was so beautiful, and Andrew, who was good at mathematics. They are all summering in a ramshackle house in the Hebrides. They are all planning a trip to the lighthouse. The entire book hinges around this essential triviality, and they all move in and out of each other's lives by means of trivial events, tiny and important. Chiefly, however, the first part of the book is concerned with the inner life of Mr. Ramsay, who wrestles with intellectual problems while looking at the geraniums, and is interrupted by his children, though comforted by his wife, and remains lonely and somewhat pitiable, and by the inner life of Mrs. Ramsay, who knits and reads aloud to James, and worries over debts, and comforts Mr. Ramsay. She is worshipped by all her guests, finds herself disturbingly superior to her husband, is lonely, and possesses qualities that are inexpressible but can be rudely translated as heroic. The second part of the book, with an exquisite interlude between, is concerned largely with Lily Briscoe's reverie. 10 years have passed. Mrs. Ramsay has suddenly died. Andrew has been killed in the war. These events are told briefly in short sentences, enclosed in brackets. The main narrative becomes the inner life of Lily Briscoe, with glimpses too into the inner life of Mr. Ramsay, more lonely in one way since his wife's death, but somehow less pitiable. The book is really the story of several people facing life and death alone, as everyone in a measure ultimately does face it. To find some other woman writer with whom to compare Mrs. Woolf's achievements in fiction, it is necessary, I believe, to go back to the Brontes, or to the immortal Jane Austen herself. End of Part 28. Part 29 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From New Fiction by T. Earl Welby, from the Saturday Review, 7th of May 1927. Mrs. Woolf is an enormously clever writer, who can yet take a schoolgirlish pleasure in her own cleverness. The type, though necessarily rare, is one that I, in common with every other reviewer, have encountered before. Where Mrs. Woolf is unique, in at any rate my experience, is that her indulgence towards her own cleverness is half humorous, which, let us hope, means that some day she will lay aside her cleverness with an ironical wistfulness, and proceed to write the masterly book of which she is clearly capable. Meanwhile, with certain reservations, we may well be thankful for To the Lighthouse. It is not exactly a success, but the world is cumbered today with highly successful novels, in which obvious and not particularly worthwhile things are done by competent, complacent writers. Mrs. Woolf, aiming at the almost impossible, achieves it only intermittently, but it is difficult to think of anyone else writing today who could have come near to it. What Mrs. Woolf is about is not the production of the plain tale usually of love. She is anxious to extort from the material common to her and other novelists that which shall be expressive of her own peculiar sense of what is significant in life, that and nothing else. Now the very greatest novelists have not fussed themselves about any such enterprise. Balzac, using every sort of material, dealing with life comprehensively, reveals to us his sense of what ultimately matters, not by any deliberate exclusion, but inevitably, unconsciously, by the way in which emphasis is distributed. Mrs. Woolf's method is nothing if not deliberate. She will select incidents which are trivial in order that the emphasis shall be on the inner lives of the characters, not on what is outwardly happening to them. She will devote a prodigious number of pages to the happenings of a single outwardly uneventful day or hour of it. She will relate outer to inner events with an ingenuity that is tireless and may become tiring. She has not confidence enough in herself to give us the whole story, or even to have what is ordinarily understood by a story, in the belief that its intimate significance will emerge under a natural treatment of it. All the same, she once more proves herself to be a writer with astonishing intuition, and mistress of a style that can make the obscurest processes of thought and emotion luminous. There is in her new novel a long description of a family and its friends at dinner, which is a triumph. Nothing seemed to have merged, they all sat separate, and the whole of the efforts of merging and flowing and creating rested on her. Again she felt, as a fact without hostility, the sterility of men, for if she did not do it, nobody would do it, and so, giving herself the little shake that one gives a watch that has stopped, the old familiar pulse began beating, as the watch begins ticking. But it is useless to begin quoting a passage far too long for complete reproduction, and needing to be reproduced in full for its appreciation. There are a dozen other passages in which the secret reactions of men and women, especially women, to the apparently trifling events of life, are rendered with a convincing and elaborate subtlety. To have written them is to have surpassed, in this one respect, almost every contemporary novelist. It is not necessarily to have written a satisfying novel. The world inhabited by Mrs. Wolfe's people. Ramsay, the thinker who has failed after his one important contribution to the thought of his day. Mrs. Ramsay, the children, the woman artist, and the awkward young intellectual staying with them, is a world in which rather too much importance attaches to going out and coming in, sitting down and standing. It is a world without the relief of insignificant things. Had there, at that wonderfully described dinner, been two sorts of soup, one feels the question, thick or clear, would have been asked with anxiety, and on the replies would have depended the future spiritual relations of several of the characters. Certainly, the question whether the family should visit the lighthouse, and the father's prediction of bad weather, suffice to open an immensely complicated theme, and it is not till page 318 that Mr. Ramsay reaches the lighthouse. The symbolical value of the lighthouse remains obscurer than it should be, and indeed I think the book unhappily named, for it ought to have been entitled Mrs. Ramsay. The presentation of that woman as she lived, and of her influence after death, is consummate. On the other hand, the parenthetical method of disposing of members of the family in the second part of the book is merely silly. Between such extremes does Mrs. Wolfe oscillate. End of part 29. Part 30 of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 6 Months in the Field of Fiction by Edwin Clarke. From the New York Times, 26th of June, 1927. The present article offers a report on the state of the novel during the past 6 months, as shown in the work of American and English novelists. To find a critical attitude that would be all-embracing is manifestly possible, for one is confronted by a great variety of attitude and methods. There is today no generally accepted theory of form as applied to the novel. It is a period of experiment. Yet there may be observed a peculiar tendency, a trend toward compression of time, a return to the classic unities with modifying reservations. While the theatre appears to be attempting to break from classical traditions, the novel in some quarters is adapting them to its uses. Notable examples of this tendency are to be noted in Green Forest, the remarkable first novel by Natalie Sedgwick Colby, and in the works of Liam O'Flaherty and Virginia Woolf. This is a happy condition to offset the serious blight of the heavy hand of sociology, for the didactic, naturalistic novel is little more than a negative force, in pushing the expansion of the novel to such an extent as to bring about a natural reaction from excess. Then, too, the new consciousness of the post-war period has loosed a flood of smart fiction, an assumed sophistication that has contributed some brightly coloured bubbles. In spite of all this, the test of the novel still rests upon the appearance of life and truth, and the creation of character or story. The laurels for first place among native novel appear to belong to Julia Peterkin for her first novel, Black April. It is a finely conceived book, and immediately suggests comparison with the perfectly realized Time of Man, which stood so singularly alone last fall. Mrs. Peterkin does not command the fresh, resourceful, original style of Miss Roberts, but both novels are highly meritorious conceptions of folk material. Mrs. Peterkin has created a new field for herself. Black April is an intensive study of an isolated part of the coastlands of South Carolina, inhabited by the blue gum Negroes of the Riceland plantations. This alien material she has perceived with a hearty comprehension, a warm humanity, and excellent restraint. In her technique, Miss Peterkin has reconciled the experimental with the traditional novel. She has adapted the method of the picaresque novel, developing a series of incidents loosely connected by the thread of narrative, and brought them into a harmonious whole by the creation of a dominant character whose influence reacts upon the others. In Black April, the foreman of the plantation, she presents an almost heroic figure. There is posited in the central character and his tragic defeat the eternal conflict between worldly living and the concepts of religion. The story deals with the trials and hard fates found among a people who live close to the earth and in direct contact with the elements and elemental emotions. It is an uncommon and notable novel in both craft and substance. The season has been marked by the reappearance of several well-known writers, the sensation, of course, being Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry, which received more space in the newspapers than probably any other novel in the history of letters. Booth Tarkington again appeared after a considerable absence. Mrs. Wharton contributed a subtle satire of New York society. Gertrude Atherton turned away from the bestseller and returned to her former historical interests. Anne Sedgwick continued in the genteel tradition. James Boyd contributed another historical novel of interest, this time the story of a private in the Civil War. In the offerings of all these novelists, there is very little in which the past hadn't fully prepared the reader. It remained for Mrs. Peterkin and Mrs. Colby to provide the excitement of the unexpected. Religion became an inordinately active subject of fiction this year. Sinclair Lewis, with his broad, flouting satire, naturally was the headliner. Elmer Gantry was a gorgeous, blatant cartoon. Here all the zeal of Mr. Lewis for reform was given vent. He attempted to be fair, to give all sides of the question, but, once his creation was well launched on his career of buffoonery and debauch, one became conscious of an interspersed monologue of the author giving vent to his own scepticism. The story had many capital bits of sharp caricature, and was effective in producing an uproar of controversy. Elmer Gantry was a straw man set up for Mr. Lewis to ridicule. With the best of Mr. Lewis's character creations, he has no standing. For all the gusto and bounce of the novel, it is inconceivable that anything so facile and obvious will endure, for after one has caught the main idea, the rest of the novel is mere repetition. Quite different was the second novel of Sylvia Townsend Warner, who, with gentle irony, a puckish humour, and a rare sense of jest, took her clergyman to the South Sea, and there let him discover to his surprise that he never did have a real religious belief. Mr. Fortune's Maggot is quite in the tradition of the 18th century satirists. Don Byrne and Irving Bachelor, turning to ancient times, write in the manner of the old-fashioned romances. Mr. Byrne has traced the career of Saul of Tarsus. The story is full of carefully worked-up descriptions of the life of the times. His method of stressing the virtues of Paul by running down Peter is perhaps a trifle crude. Mr. Bachelor's novel tells the tale of the wanderings of Dollis of Colossae. He skilfully avoided a pious sentimentality. Among the new writers there are a number who have performed with more than promise. After Mrs. Peterkin, the honours go to Mrs. Colby for her brilliantly written Green Forest. This is a modification of the experimental novel, which rises above imitation and experiment. In actual passage of time it is limited to the period of an Atlantic crossing, but in its projection of memory it embraces a lifetime. Several of the characterizations are superb. Behind a limiting and restless point of view, it presents a facility for handling comedy types and situations in a blending of wit and observation. With all its intellectual hardness, it has a fresh and rare perception of ironic comedy. Charlotte Haldane, the wife of the well-known English chemist, offered a satirical speculation upon the hypodermic age of the future. It is a wise and witty book that adroitly plays with ideas. The grotesque visualization has been ably sustained to emerge in a reductio ad absurdum of modern geneticists. Half Gods by Murray Sheehan is another fantastic first novel. Mr. Sheehan fashions a tale, half real, half fancy, in which a centaur is born on the farm of a family of Missouri hillbillies. Apparently, for some reason, Mr. Sheehan was self-conscious of his satire and milieu, and his excellent idea was not developed to its full possibilities. He has, however, the beginnings of a good style, shrewd observation and humour, and has achieved a Middle Western study that wasn't corrupted by the drabness of its matter. O. E. Rulfag, a professor in the Northwest, calls his Giants in the Earth a modern saga. It is a compelling chronicle of the pioneering days of the last century, a blend of fiction and history. The combination isn't entirely satisfactory, for, more than a novel, it is a human document of the early days. It offers a vast panorama of the settling of the Northwest, with the pioneers pitting themselves against the natural elements. It visualizes, with stimulating and imaginative force, and a simplicity of manner, heroic behaviour in an age that has disappeared into legend. Distinctly a different type of novel was Springboard by Robert Wolfe. In his hands, the college novel has reached maturity. It is a dignified and sympathetic study of the difficulties of adolescence. Edna Bryner's Andy Brandt's Ark is another novel of protest. A satire on a dominant mother, it is an uneven performance. The family portrayed is an interesting group, but the satire is somewhat forced. Miss Bryner's next novel will be worth watching for. In The Woman on the Balcony, which is a bad title that masks a story of passionate intensity, Rose Kaler has set down against the background of Chicago a discerning account of the trials of several souls in wedlock. On such a trite and familiar subject, her book is surprisingly refreshing. In Bread and Fire, Charles Walker has presented an autobiographical story of industrial unrest. This novel has a poignant, disturbing quality in its treatment of the curiosity of modern young man to find out what it is all about. The clever, superficially sophisticated The Red Pavilion by John Gunther showed a talent for narrative in a novel that re-echoes the recent smart fiction. Many of the younger writers showed growth in their latest work. Anne Parrish in Tomorrow Morning concerned herself with a concept of failure due to the difficulty of adjustment to a new order. It is a more discerning book than The Perennial Bachelor. Isa Glenn's second novel is a document of social interest. Again, her background is the Orient, and her story that of a child who is the victim of quarrelling parents. The novel suffers from her uncertain treatment of the child. Struthers Burt has written a novel of contrasts. The Delectable Mountains offers an objection to popular illusions regarding the West. It is a well-organized novel that rounds to a happy end. Somehow Mr. Burt just misses being first-rate. Perhaps it is his confident, sane outlook, where a touch of madness would put him on edge. George Hummel, with several capable novels behind him, in his recent appearance was bogged in a sea of inhibitions in his story of a New England woman's frustrated heart. Mrs. Banning, in Pressure, showed growing power in her arraignment of middle-class American society. Helen Hall, a novelist of growing distinction, who frequently is mistaken for the authority on shakes, was represented in a fresh, vigorous story of 3 generations. Islanders relates the fortunes of a family, the outstanding individual being a woman of rare courage and inquiring mind. Its picture of the passing American scene of the last 70 years is a protest against pushing woman into the background of family life when it comes to a decision calling for action. It is a comprehensive novel of arresting interest and well-rounded characters. Red Damask is a worthy successor to Talk. With this book, Miss Sachs is in position to be compared to J.B. Stern. A German Jewish family has grown rich in 3 short generations and is beginning to leave its isolated inter-family life for one of wider scope. Naturally, it is the younger members breaking from the traditional groups who are to be confronted with interracial jealousy and social barriers. The story of Abby Hall and her difficult loves is remarkable. With wisdom and candour, the novel surmounts the partisanship. With tolerance, it sets down the ancient clash of young and old, Jew and Gentile. A stimulating novel, if there ever was one. Percy Marks, in Lord of Himself, has added a sequel to his earlier novel, The Plastic Age. Mr. Marks is sympathetic, and his account of the efforts of his collegians to find themselves is racy but sentimental. Harry Harvey's Kongai shows improved technical management. It is a fascinating and colourful account of the mixed-bred women of French China and their European lovers. The writing of war novels has entered a new stage. Apparently, the period of disillusionment has gone by, and humour enters in. Leonard Nason's Doughboys are heroes bursting into wisecracks and slapstick. 3 Lights from a Match, for all its natural swank, is, in its exaggeration, almost in the class with those who found glory at the bottom of every muddy trench. Mattock, by James Stephens, while A Tale of a Non-Combat Division, gave a different version. It is the pathetic record of a moron from Kansas trying to be a Christian American soldier and a good fellow to his comrades at the same time. The real talk and stuff of army life is in this novel. The historical novel seems to be reviving. James Boyd, in Marching On, views the Civil War through the eyes of a poor farm boy in the ranks, and obtains a new perspective. His novel is a faithful recreation of the period of struggle as it appeared to the ordinary individual shut away from the gaudy moments of melodrama. In Forever Free, Honoré Wilcie Morrow has written a satisfying biographical novel of the life of Lincoln up to the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. Evelyn Scott's study of the pre-war South in Migrations is from another point of view. She is concerned with the influence of ideas upon Southern society. Her novel is pungent and fragmentary. It might be the start of a several-volume novel designed to show the South moving west to various urges. In its characters and picturesque detail, it is attractively engaging. In her new novel, Mrs. Atherton reflects the life of ancient Greece. She has told the love life of Pericles and Aspasia against the rich Hellenic background of Greece's Golden Age. Mrs. Atherton prefers the brilliant figure, and in Aspasia she has a character of high talent. She appears the modern, unconventional woman, acting contrary to the accepted mores, in living with Pericles, who could not marry her, having a wife already. Pericles, too, comes alive in the novel. One sees him as an ardent lover, a sorrowing father, and an orator pleading magnificently in defence of Aspasia. The characters of Socrates, Sophocles, Phidias and Alcibiades are lifelike and add to the glamour of the Attic scene. This brings us to the performances of some of the established names in the novel. In Twilight Sleep, Mrs. Wharton has written one of her most technically perfect stories. A wealthy woman masks herself behind a complacently busy life of social interest in order that she may never come to close quarters with life. The inevitably tragic episode occurs and is detachedly observed. It is a gracefully written, hard, relentless, ironic study of the best people and their folly. Mr. Tarkington, in The Plutocrat, makes a hero of a Babbit. This novel is Mr. Tarkington's answer to those who go abroad and knock their native land. The greater part of the book is concerned with the behaviour of a boisterous businessman abroad, a hearty fellow in whom Mr. Tarkington sees much of the heroic stuff of which the old Romans were made. In Dear Old Templeton, Miss Alice Brown has written an old-fashioned novel in her leisurely manner. A man on in years attempts to break away and do what he likes himself, only to discover that his family are all too busy doing what they like to give him a chance. It has a quiet, understanding way and simple charm. Again, Anne Douglas Sedgwick contrasts the civilizations of the French and English. The old Countess is an interesting study in character drawing, if not greatly distinguished. Her dexterity turns an odd and extremely incredible romantic into an acceptable, even sympathetic character. Of the British writers, the best work of the year has been turned in by the younger writers just reaching full maturity. Among these, Liam O'Flaherty is a writer of astonishing modern style and power. He has been influenced by Synge and Joyce, and probably the Continent, as his work is out of the English tradition. He is concerned with the obsession of terror and flight. His Mrs. Gilhooly is prodigious. It is more than a psychological study of a well-known Irish type. It is alive, fused by the rampant energy that blends imaginative and realistic detail into a narrative of such strength as to suggest the possession of nothing less than genius. The revelation of character is a deep probing of the dark places of the heart and mind. A novel marking considerable change of style is F. Brett Young's Love is Enough, a story of the English countryside that will make any Englishman homesick in far-off places. With such a background, he has traced minutely the life of a gentlewoman from birth to early autumn. Mr. Young's chronicle of the passing of 3 generations of 2 English families is full of full-length portraits that are in the best tradition of the English novel. The shorter novel of David Garnett's, Go She Must, has also the background of England's garden vistas. He no longer traffics with the fables of man and animals, but the note of fantasy, with its varying imaginative implications, illuminates the adventures of this odd young woman living in a country vicarage. Another novel of the country gentry is Row Forest by Anthony Pride. It is a well-balanced study of the changing order. Against the intruding new rich, the impoverished landed family, in this instance of Row Forest, in debt through their elders, refused to slip into graceful decay and abandon their ancestral home to upstarts. There is hearty blood to this family, and a real struggle is made, which is contrary to the conventional tale of the broken-down nobleman, a novel of well-drawn characters and carefully sustained interest. The fiction of Mrs. Delafield has recently shown a steady advance. In Gill, a post-war study of London, she has presented a most interesting group of people in sharp contrast to each other. With dexterity she has commanded a divided interest in her characterization of a hard, sophisticated young couple made rotters by the war, and of a young woman whose simplicity and native shrewdness mark her as a child of nature. In the Allinghams, May Sinclair has told of a family of children being inhibited by their old-fashioned parents. As a family of children, they are incredibly unlike each other, and the victims of Freud rather than fate. Storm Jameson has turned back to the time of wooden ships. Her heroine in The Lovely Ship becomes the dominant factor in a shipyard and is too strong a character to find any satisfaction in her lovers. But feminism in The Lovely Ship warps not only the heart and mind of the heroine, but also the ending of the novel. The early years of clipper building are picturesquely described. The gift of Miss Warner's Mr. Fortune's maggot is a deft compression of method. With almost as much topsy-turvy fantasy as Chesterton, in transmuting the commonplace into things fantastic, she brings Robinson Crusoe up to date in about the same manner that Chesterton would reverse the modern into the dress of the Middle Ages. The spiritual adventure of Mr. Fortune in the South Sea is a comedy of perfected storytelling. The paradoxical and genial Chesterton has worked his magic spell again in the return of Don Quixote. He has returned to the manner of his Man Who Was Thursday, Man Alive, and Napoleon of Notting Hill. He stages a revolution against present-day industrial life by putting England into Lincoln Green. His robust humour, the spell of his fancy, make practical jokes of maternity and bring love, chivalry, romance, and beauty to replace a hard and dirty civilization. Virginia Woolf is the exponent of the experimental fiction in England. Commanding a subtle and resilient style, she has carried her experiment to the point of achievement. To the Lighthouse is a novel of more complex construction than the previous Mrs. Dalloway. Here the stream of consciousness, of reverie, is employed in an analysis of domestic psychology. Mrs. Woolf's novels are written out of the intellect. For all her versatile craft, she seems to have reached the limitation of this method, and still leaves something to be desired. She stands as the chief figure of modernism in England, and must be included with Joyce and Proust in the realization of experimental achievements that have completely broken with tradition. A posthumous novel by the late Olive Schreiner has evoked the memory of her African protest. From Man to Man was left unfinished by Olive Schreiner, but she had been considering it and working on it for nearly 50 years. It is the story of two sisters and sexual injustice. What with feminism and modern life, it is already dated. It is saved from being solely a thesis novel by the bitter sincerity and ability to evoke memorable incidents in clearly shown pictures. The difference in attitude is obvious when one turns to Pauline Smith's tale of Little Carew. The Beadle is a tale of imposed simplicity and compassionate feeling. It projects the Boers as they never have been done before, a homely, kindly folk of simple fate living close to the soil. It tells a story of youthful love and the visiting stranger that is free of protest and moves with insight and understanding of character. It marks Miss Smith as a young writer of potentiality and a fine performance. Warwick Deeping in Doomsday appears to be nothing more than a competent popular novelist. W. B. Maxwell continues to mix up modern life with Victorian sensibility in novels where plot dominates the material. In The Marionette, Edwin Muir has evoked fantasy in his pathetic and precisely etched chronicle of the tragedy of a father and son. Compton Mackenzie in Rogues and Vagabonds turns back to the 19th century and writes of stage folks in a long, diffuse novel. It is something in the manner of his early novels, but strive as he may, the old spark and fire of them is not here. End of Part 30. End of Contemporary Reviews of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf.